This is the Everyone's Agnostic Podcast with Cass Midgley and Marie D'Elephant.
We interview people you don't know about a subject no one wants to talk about. We hope to encourage people in the process of deconstructing their faith and help curb the loneliness that accompanies it. We think the world is a better place when more people live by sight, not by faith. Please subscribe to our podcast and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, you can support us monetarily in 2 easy ways. You can pledge
$1 million
or more through Patreon. That's patreon.com/EA podcast, or leave a lump sum donation through PayPal at our website, everyone'sagnostic.com. The smallest contribution is greatly appreciated.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 231 of the Everyone's Agnostic Podcast. I'm Cass Midgley. Someday I'm going to go to sleep and never wake up. A big thanks to each and every one of our Patreon and PayPal supporters. Today, Marie D'Elephant and I chat with Dr. Eric Sprankle. Dr. Sprankle is an associate professor of psychology and co-director of the Sexuality Studies program at Minnesota State University, Mankato. He's also a licensed psychologist and certified sex therapist at the Minnesota Sexual Health Institute in Minneapolis. He lives with his wife, Katie, and 2 cats, Lucy and Mina, in South Minneapolis, where they bask in being called devil worshippers by their family. Marie loaded up the show notes for this episode with a ton of sex-positive links, and specifically reclaiming your sexuality from God-type links. So check those out if you're looking for some healing in that area. I'm curious about something. I wonder if the invisible, all-knowing Sky Daddy that I adopted didn't serve as an imagination to me that I'm finally loved by someone who knows me, really knows me. I believed God knew me completely, better than anyone could ever know me, all my secrets, my sins, and yet He loved me unconditionally. At last. Here was my opportunity to take my mask off before Him, to let down my guard, to take off my makeup, my cool clothes, my perfect hair, my sassy sense of humor, my amazing intellect and knowledge of world trivia, my sexual purity, my athleticism, my artistic prowess in acting or singing or poetry or painting. All my grand performances to win the applause of my parents, siblings, aunts and uncles, cousins, friends, even my enemies. To be lifted upon the shoulders of friends in a "for he's a jolly good fellow" refrain, and all the exhaustion that comes from upholding that image, I could then drop because, after all, God sees past all of that, no sense in hiding, and yet loves me just as I am. Do you realize how restful that sounds? Maybe you do. Maybe you felt it. I felt it. Like a coach telling me I could stop running laps. Thank you. Like a prison warden paroling me early from my 30-year sentence. Or like a miner trapped in a mine a mile underground, getting rescued to the surface. This is how it felt to finally be loved and to trust that love. At last I was loved for just being me. And then I found out something horrific, something devastating. To find out that Savior didn't exist. The rescue isn't coming. The warden didn't pardon me. The coach says you've got 10 more miles to go on your run. Back to hiding my flaws from society. More shame around my temptation to lie, cheat, lust, or overeat. Isn't there a bottom I could land on and stop caring what people think? Can't I reach a point of exhaustion so desperate that I'd rather take my own life than live this lie? Or could I decide to stay in this life, on this planet, and in this body, and stop giving a fuck who likes or dislikes me? That I can take the mask off. I can risk being vulnerable and letting people see me. That more than ever I can say yes to what it means to be me. That I could be that God who loved me unconditionally. That I can relax and let the people who are drawn to me come and those who are not go. That I can like what I like without having to defend or justify it to arms-folded judge fuckers. No more hiding, no more lying, especially to myself. No more propping up false narratives that make me feel good about otherwise harsh realities. I've got this. I've got this thing we call life. I've got this body, this mind, this voice, this elbow, this tongue with taste buds and a world of food and laughter and mirrors that reflect back something I can smile at, and carnival rides and skinny dipping in a nasty pond and drying out later with my waterproof skin, and 2 eyes that see one thing in stereo, and ears, fucking ears, sound waves that make me cry, rhythms that make me dance, and the feeling of another person's skin against mine, the electricity that runs through my body causing pleasure and pain. What the fuck? What is this place, and why diminish it or tame it or shrink back from it with lies and narratives that castrate it and break it like a wild horse? No, I'm here and I'm glad to be here. I'm the God of Cass Midgley, and I fucking love what's going on right here in this body, in this place, with this circle of friends and community that I find myself. I know everything about myself, and yet I love myself. I know I'm an asshole sometimes. My flaws are pretty obvious. I'm rather shameless about them now, sometimes to a fault, where I jab them in people's faces who don't really deserve it and certainly didn't ask for it. But I'm learning how to be me in socially appropriate ways here in this real world, having emerged from the subculture of Christianity into this big, scary, godless society I was taught by the scriptures to eschew. Today, I recognize that in my journey early on, I needed someone to love me and my most naked self. And I found that. God loved me, and that propped me up, like scaffolding, girding up my fragile self-esteem. I attached to God's support and love like metal leg braces that I never took off. I strove to be a man of God, a man after God's own heart, to be that guy of whom he said, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." He was not ashamed of me, so I was not ashamed of him. And I wanted everyone to know this love, and it became my life's mission and purpose. There were times throughout my life where it looked as if my leg braces were a holograph, the metal bars appearing translucent for moments, and deep down I had a what-the-fuck moment and wondered what I just saw and pondered if something was fishy, but quickly quarantined such thoughts for the sheer horror of their possible credibility. But over the years, the erosion of my personal dignity became apparent. I'd seen many times that the leg braces, the scaffolding around my soul, was not real, and I had continued to deny it, self-delude, and ultimately lie to myself. How did it come to this, I wondered, that I have to choose between Christianity and my integrity? Around age 40, I chose integrity. I chose the road less traveled, at least where I came from. I chose love, real love. I chose to stop saying no to reality and start saying yes to what is. But my skin, my tendons, my sinews were woven into the scaffolding of God's love and support, and I knew I had to rip myself apart from it. The fact that the leg braces were actually never there did little to diminish the pain of tearing myself apart from them, from God. But after a while, my skin healed. My sinews reattached and my muscles grew strong. I could stand up on my own without the braces and even walk. I learned to love myself in all the places where the scriptures had shamed me, especially my sexuality. I now love my body and the sensations it desires. I love what happens to me when I come. I love helping my wife come. We all do it. Why is it embarrassing to talk about? As if up until I just told you, you didn't know that we have sex. Why do we cringe at the mental image of our friends having sex? Especially our parents or siblings. Ugh. Sure, I don't want to have sex with them, but why am I making it about me? Why not just celebrate that they're doing it and that all humans are doing it? Because it's good. It's a good thing. It helps people. It calibrates relationships and helps our nervous system and our blood flow. It's one of the most amazing miracles of being alive. Anyway, I divorced myself from that codependent marriage with holographic God and replaced him with my own acceptance, and it's made a world of difference. I have my own love. Some of you love me, and I feel that. And unlike imaginary leg braces, it's real. I unashamedly take pride in the caliber of my listeners. You people are badass. You're smart. You're holistic. You're soulistic and compassionate. It's as if we're connected and we see ourselves as connected. As Bob used to say, you're me and I'm you. In Christianity, I always felt that the majority of the people were guarded, hiding something, afraid and ashamed of something, and thus false and fake. But not so with you beautiful people. My experience with you is a real connection. I feel it. It's there. Maybe because we're no longer ashamed and we're bringing our authentic selves. Our self-acceptance empowers us to be vulnerable. I'm not afraid of you seeing me, and I'm not afraid of you rejecting me. My validation does not hinge on anyone's applause, at least most of the time. I'm valid because I exist. I didn't ask to be here. I didn't order this body. It just came with it. It just is and happens to be me, or at least bear my consciousness. I am the God of Cass Midgley, and he's invited me into his heart. Not to be saved from anything. Oh, and you can invite me into your heart too. But fair warning, I don't answer prayers, heal your diseases, or empower you to move mountains. Wait a second. I really am a God. We taped this conversation on January 12th, 2019. The intro music on this episode is Just Groove Me by Dave Weckl. The segue music on this episode is a looped drum track played by Johnny Jackson of the Jackson 5. Thanks for listening, and be a yes-sayer to what is.
Today's discussion with Dr. Eric Sprankle is about something that I am very passionate about: recovering our sexuality post-religion. During my Christian upbringing, I was exposed to the purity culture movement of the mid-90s. You know, I kissed dating goodbye, true love waits, purity rings. I am very insecure. I never felt cute enough, coquettish enough, sexy enough, which didn't mean that I wasn't interested in boys. I was very interested in boys. Did I talk to boys? No, I did not talk to boys. Our family did not talk about sex. What I knew, I found out from looking at porn on AOL and from our meager health education class at my private Lutheran school. My sexual shame, though, I learned from religion. Touching myself was a sin. Lusting after someone else was a sin. Having sex before marriage was a sin. Having more than one partner was a sin. Being anything but heterosexual was a sin. And being the kid that I was, I bought all of it. And so when I was 13 and I was starting to feel those hormones and now having access to this new thing called the internet, I was horny as hell, but blockaded by shame at every turn. Every time that I engaged with my sexuality, I was bombarded by unrelenting guilt. I would feel like I had to throw up. I would always immediately chastise myself for failing yet again to be pure as God had called me to be. I never, ever considered that what I was doing with my body just might be okay. I knew it was a sin and that I had a horrible sinner caving to my sexual desires when God was calling me to rise above it. And I believed all of this until my mid-20s. Now, I don't know how many of you may be able to relate to me, but just because I shed a belief in God and in religion didn't mean that all the indoctrination went away too. For years, I have struggled with my own sexuality, with acknowledging and asking for what I want without shame or guilt.
part of the reason I decided to explore polyamory was specifically to have a landscape to work through my hang-ups and my fears. So I am very passionate about recovering my sexuality from my religious upbringing. And that passion led me to discover Dr. Eric Sprankle. I first found out about Dr. Sprankle through Wildflower Sex, a pleasure-positive online sexual wellness store for everyone, which, if I may derail for just a moment, I highly recommend you go to Instagram right now and follow them. They put out some amazing sex-positive content that is just mind-blowingly informative and normalizing. And Dr. Sprankle produces extremely sharp and intelligent content about sexuality, such as this quote, "Abstinence education says premarital sex makes you a chewed-up piece of gum. Rest assured, your sexuality is actually an everlasting gobstopper." Or this other quote, "An orgasm doesn't have to be the climax. Sexual satisfaction doesn't have to be dependent on one bodily response." It's the kind of stuff that normalizes the range of our sexual experience. In the interview, Dr. Sprankle talks about how many teach about what sex should be, presupposing that sex is intrinsically something. What is liberating and at the same time terrifying for me is realizing that sexuality truly is whatever we make of it. There are no prescriptions other than basic consent, autonomy, and knowledge. This interview was extremely edifying to my personal sexual growth, and I have felt even more emboldened to know who I am, what I want, without shame and without apologies. But before we get to that interview, I just want to make a few quick announcements. If you want to check out the latest episode of the podcast Ginger Snaps, you will hear an interview with me and William and Amy. Also, Cass was interviewed recently on Voices of Deconversion, and I was interviewed recently on Inciting Incident, where we talk about the death of Deb McTaggart. Additionally, we will be interviewed shortly by Church of Atheism, so keep an eye out for that. And we want to remind you that we have some badass Say Yes to What Is stickers, thanks to our listeners, Christy and Bonnie. They are $5 for 5 stickers, which includes shipping and handling within the U.S. So you can check those out on our website at everyone'sagnostic.com for more information. And if you become a Patreon supporter, you get one free. And also, if you've already been a guest on our show, you also get a sticker for free, so email us to get hooked up. And we do want to thank Rachel Midgley for our new sexy logo. It looks pretty fucking great. And lastly, thanks for tuning in, everyone. As a reminder, you can email us anytime at everyone'sagnostic@gmail.com. If you want to be added as a guest in the future, or you have a suggestion for us for a future guest, or if you want us to come on to your podcast or order any merchandise from us, if you want to sponsor us or join our online private Facebook community, you can also send us fan art because I'm pretty. Also, feel free to follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Cass and I have our own personal accounts on there, and I post some pretty stupid-ass shit. Like, I mostly post right now about this new guy that I'm dating that I call Date Boy. So it's awkward, so you might enjoy that. So feel free to follow us. Anyway, enjoy this interview. I hope you find it as helpful as I did. Thanks, everyone.
So, Eric, I'm grateful that you're here. Marie found you and has been talking you up for months now, I think. What this show is we have talked to people that have deconstructed their childhood faith, and it turns out it's kind of traumatic depending upon how devout one is. And so people hearing other people's stories makes them feel less alone, less crazy. And we figure out ways to, rebuild, redefine, and reinvent ourselves without that faith that was so much a part of our lives. So I start with the question of, like, did you have a religious upbringing?
I did. I was raised Roman Catholic, primarily from my mom's side, and my dad converted to Catholicism before they got married. And so I was raised going to Mass every Sunday, all the rites of passage that come with Catholicism, like First Communion and Confirmation.
You got any siblings?
I do. I have an older sister.
Is your sister still Catholic?
No, not at all.
Mm-hmm.
She left the faith. She's still Christian. I believe she's part of the Brethren kind of faith.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So were you ever super into Catholicism, or it was something more like a nominal thing that you kind of felt obligated to do?
It was more of just what my reality was. I didn't really question it when I was younger.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for a lot of Catholics. I don't want to speak for other people, but the sense that I get for a lot within the Catholic community, it's just so ritualized and so ingrained in the culture. It's like, this is just what we do on Sunday.
Right.
We say this quick little prayer before we eat.
Right.
We have our rosaries. We have the crucifixes on our walls. We have a little children's Bible and prayer cards and stuff like that. But without really thinking deeply about the spirituality behind it, the faith behind it, or even the dogma behind it, it's just behavioral.
Yeah,
It's
I was going to
going
ask.
through
It
the
sounds like it
motions.
was more cultural versus indoctrinating, right?
Yeah, or at least that's kind of, maybe everything was like bouncing off of me and I wasn't really paying attention closely, but it just felt very behavioral.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have to be paying attention when you're a child. You walk right into it. I mean, everything from the English language to this is the color of the paint on the walls of my house. As a child, you're taking in all this data and you're going, oh, okay, this is what it's like to be me. This is my life. These are my parents. This is our religion. And it just, and like you said, the West is so steeped in this. And I don't know. Have you ever read or heard of John Gray? He's a professor in Great Britain.
I don't think so.
I just recently heard an interview with him, and he was I don't know. He was just talking about how even deconverts like myself, and he was being interviewed by Ryan Bell, and he's an ex-pastor like myself. Even atheism, especially humanism, is still laden with Christian influence and don't even know it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely make the parallel between that and what I teach within my sexuality and sexual health classes is that oftentimes we don't get direct, explicit messages about sex that it's very positive, or in more likely cases that it's very negative, but we don't have to. We get a lot of indirect messages. It not being talked about openly is a message. And so, like you were saying, we absorb all these things just being living human beings in this culture, and it's going to have an impact on us.
Yeah. We often say that it's the water we're swimming in. I mean, fish don't know what water is.
Right.
Yeah. So your parents still alive and Catholic?
Yep. Not Catholic so much. My dad has identified as an agnostic. I don't know how long he has kind of adopted that worldview. One thing that was interesting that it's always stood out to me during my development is I had, a children's Bible, and I was kind of reading through it. I don't know how old I was, definitely like grade school. So maybe between the ages of 8 and 12. And I remember my dad saying something like, oh, these are just kind of stories. So kind of, and that really kind of stuck with me of kind of like, oh, this is just kind of fiction. And I think particularly he was talking about like the Adam and Eve story, and maybe I was questioning something with it. But he was really just kind of saying, oh, these are just kind of, tales. No different than my Mother Goose book that was sitting right next to my Bible.
Yeah.
Well,
and so, but it wasn't until I was an adult that I started talking about how he's an agnostic, and he's pretty spiritual still. So he believes in like an afterlife. He believes in ghosts and stuff like that, but not
really?
necessarily a god.
Yeah.
And they're in Minnesota too?
No, I'm originally from Ohio.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I was curious, like in this Catholic upbringing that you have, and I'm going to guess the answer, but like, doesn't sound like you ever received any explicit messages about sexuality Or did you like, because Catholicism, they're pretty anti-masturbation, right?
Mhm.
And so like, was that ever explicitly spoken, or was it more like what you're talking about in that the message was more in it's not being spoken about at all?
Yeah, it was more the indirect message.
Okay.
I've reflected on this a lot, trying to think of, did I receive any explicit or direct message
Yeah.
that was anti-sex, anti-sexual health,
Yeah.
whether it's against masturbation or porn or anti-gay, whatever the case may be, everything that's part of like Vatican dogma, I just don't really recall.
Yeah.
So I think it was more of just kind of like this unspoken dogma.
Right.
And certainly how I conceptualize the incompatibility with sexuality and spirituality, even though I can understand how some combine those and intertwine those. I think that's very difficult for our Christian culture, because the cross certainly isn't like a sex symbol. Walking into a church,
I know he's
isn't-
pretty ripped on there sometimes.
Right? Yeah, sometimes he has really
Some people
nice
have
abs.
that kink there. I'm pretty sure there's a Jesus kink out there.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if I
yeah.
can say it, then it's out
Right,
there.
it exists. Yeah, and there's a whole market for it.
There is.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
like walking into a church isn't like a sexy feeling. And having those feelings or even talking about that can even be considered blasphemous.
Yeah.
So it is like this indirect kind of unspoken thing that spirituality exists over here and sexuality exists distant from
Right.
that.
And I think that speaks to a word that we use a lot on this show called disembodiment.
Mm-hmm.
I think being raised as a Christian, especially with any messages about sexuality being bad or our bodies being bad or any of those things result in this experience of disembodiment where you hate your body or you reject anything that your body tells you, specifically when it comes to sexuality. And that's what that brings up to me. Yeah. You put it in really good words, sexuality, against, how did you say it? How sexuality and spirituality can't.
I'm not
At
sure
least
that
for
words
you.
that
They had
used,
quarantined
For
it.
you anyway,
They'd separated it, and that's the way they wanted
Yeah.
it. In fact,
Yeah.
in a way, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. I mean, I think there's a way, and at least an intent or a desire to compartmentalize sexuality altogether. I think if you got right down to it, a lot of hyper-religious people probably just wish that we weren't sexual at all. I mean, maybe publicly,
absolutely.
but maybe privately they'd probably love it, but I don't know.
No, I was just saying that's one passage, and I didn't write it down. I don't know where it comes from, someplace in the New Testament, because I was trying to think of like, oftentimes the message, again, either indirectly or directly, is that we have to overcome our sexuality. We have to overcome even just our physicality, right? Because it's incompatible with our spirituality.
Yeah.
That's often things that are associated with demons and the devil. Is we're earthbound, we're physical, it's flesh. And this is something that we need to overcome and to conquer to become closer to God, to become more spiritual. And there's one passage that really kind of focused on this specifically, and I just like read it like 2 weeks ago, and I was like, oh yes, this is exactly what I've been talking about this whole time. It's something relating to have to crucify the flesh. And Pastor John Hagee, who I like to troll on Twitter, he quoted that, and I was like, yes, that's explicitly the message that permeates our society, that our physicality and especially our sexuality is almost like a curse, an earthbound curse that we need to like overcome and rise above in order to be spiritual and holy people.
Yeah. And this brings up for me what I keep seeing is that I think as humans with our prefrontal cortex, with being what we are, being able to think abstractly, being aware of our own mortality makes us afraid, because we don't want to be like the other animals who are just dying and rotting and fucking and doing whatever. It's our denial of our animalism, I think, to start creating these like dualistic constructs. And I think putting sexuality over here and physicality over here is our way of saying, no, we're not like animals.
Right.
We don't belong to this earth. We are, godly, that we have spirits, that we're not like them, that there's more for us than just death.
Yeah.
And so for me, like pretty much every conversation that we have about being a former fundamentalist or any of the doctrines that are in religion come down to this denial or like of not wanting to be an animal, like not wanting to be associated to the cat that I just put down on Wednesday.
Right.
But my body is going to do the exact same thing as hers. And So I love talking about that, our denial of being animals.
Yeah, it's very like a human exceptionalism
Yeah,
kind of thing.
it's speciesism,
Right, yeah.
which is a new word that I don't know if I made up. I doubt I made it
No,
up, but it's totally a thing.
I would say that human supremacy or whatever over the animals, they, because that's Genesis 1:1, have dominion over the earth and such. But I think that they do elevate humans over animals, but only one notch. The real elevation is their spirit being. And this is part of that detachment and disembodiment we were talking about, because ultimately what they celebrate and what is that the body rots, and the body stays on earth, whereas the spirit goes on. And so I'm just saying that their supremacy doesn't stop with just being human. It moves on to actually, I don't think they like being human. I think they can't wait to get to heaven and have a heavenly body and be sinless and stuff. I think Christians, well, I'm speaking for myself. I mean, I don't think I did it to the degree in which I see it in others, but I think Christians, to some degree, resent their very existence. I mean, they just can't wait to get to heaven where things are right, because the injustice down here. I mean, that's why heaven and hell were created in the imaginations of men. There's got to be somewhere where Hitler gets his comeuppance or something. There's just a sense of injustice, and I think that's the grounding of the creation of afterlife justice system.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to move on to your Satanism, because I'm fascinated with this, and so I guess at what age did you engage with that, and how did that play out?
Well, I think we should clarify those terms too, especially given a lot of the media exposure that I had back in December 2018, calling me a Satanist. So how I view Satanism is very similar to like the Satanic Temple or the Church of Satan, in which they're atheistic. And then there are differences between the Church of Satan and the Satanic Temple in terms of like philosophy and like what Satanism means to them. But it's not devil worship. There's no belief in the devil and things like that. Mm-hmm. So, and then my personal involvement in all that currently is more of just a label. I like satanic imagery and aesthetics. I've been interested in horror movies since I was in diapers. I mean, Michael Jackson's Thriller, the music video came out when I was like 2, and I remember watching that. And from there, I was just being obsessed with Halloween and monsters and demons and everything like that. And then once I got into like, no, it was actually 5th grade, I started getting into heavy metal, and then definitely more so in the 90s when industrial music started becoming very popular, and like 9 Inch Nails and Marilyn Manson and things like that.
So you like legit love it? Because I was curious about that too, because I was kind of wondering if it was more of a spaghetti monster kind of thing, that you're using it as a device to point out the absurdity, but it sounds like it also has a significant meaning for you, which is legit. And that's what I was kind of curious about.
It's both. So that's the aesthetic piece. Yeah. So I have, inverted pentagrams and pinnacles in my house, Baphomet statues, things like that. Yeah. And that's just, I do post photos of that occasionally, but that's just for my own decor. That's what I like to be surrounded by.
Right.
But then there is that poking and provocation piece, the political piece of Satanism, at least with the Satanic Temple, more so than the Church of Satan, that is also very appealing to point out Christian supremacy, double standards that we have about quote unquote religious freedom. And I just love and really support everything that the Satanic Temple is doing politically of challenging like 10 Commandment statues being erected on, public property. And even down in Belle Plaine, there is a cross on public property that the Satanic Temple got involved in, of wanting their own war memorial that had an inverted pentagram and things like that. So, and it really challenges like, oh no, this is perfectly constitutional, and no, this isn't really endorsing religion. Be like, okay, if it's not, then you have to allow, our Baphomet statue right next to it, and be like, okay, maybe not. Let's remove these.
And I think it's also intriguing, because I doubt that this is where you're coming from with your Satanism, but I think it's a book called Memnoch the Devil by Anne Rice that talked about Satan actually being like a good character, because he was the one that wanted to give humans knowledge. Right. And so like that used to be the story of like, oh, that mean old Satan doing bad shit again. But now I'm like, oh, like he advocated for our empowerment and for our own like education, while God was like, don't, being a dick and like just worship me all the time. And so like I've heard people kind of spinning the story and being like, Satan is actually the hero in this story. Like Satan is the better person in this whole thing. Like, there's
just been a 2,000-year smear campaign
against
this character.
Right. Nobody's talking about that.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's this other piece that I don't fully adopt or adhere to that other Satanists would be more of the religious aspect, even if it's atheistic religious aspect of Satanism that involves a sense of community with other Satanists and a sense of ritual and whatever that would look like. And I lack those two components. I'm not really a social person. So, and I never feel like, oh, these are my people. This is kind of like my home. Even professionally, I don't feel like I have even a professional home at like go to a sex therapy conference, be like, all right, I'm getting excited. These are going to be my people. I get there, I'm like, nah, I don't think so. I don't really like them that much. We have this sexuality interest in common, but really nothing else.
Exactly.
And then the ritualistic piece, I don't really have either. I explored that a little bit this past December. I was following some accounts online, social media accounts that were really getting into winter folklore and the darker aspects of winter folklore. They were calling it like Gothic Advent. And it really makes sense. I mean, I'm 37 and never really thought of it this way just because December is so dominated by Christmas and that's like the only holiday. But at least for individuals in the Northern Hemisphere, it's dark and it's cold. And so, of course, that's going to help emerge ghost stories and monster stories. And so they were looking at a lot of different history of like little devils and demons and things that those primarily in Europe, Northern Europe and Eastern Europe believed and have rituals around. And so that was really interesting to kind of learn about, and that there's a lot more to that holiday season, or rather just the winter season itself, just like the changing of the seasons than it's around the solstice. And I knew about like Saturnalia and stuff like that coming from Italy, but so maybe something in the future could become ritualistic with
but it sounds
something
like maybe
else.
Something on a more of a personal basis
certainly
rather
personal.
than communal.
Yeah, I just never have had that communal feeling.
Yeah.
And I think that's just me kind of being more of a loner. And
right.
introvert.
And so maybe you don't know the answer to this because sometimes we just like what we like. But I'm curious, if you do know why, can you talk about what draws you to these things that you like the horror films, that you love, Marilyn Manson? I saw the picture that you have with him, and like, what is it? Just, I can't explain it, I just love it. Is it just like, is it this, I hate that the world is denying death and I just love embracing it? Or do you know what draws you to that?
No, being drawn to like the darker elements of society or darker entertainment that has existed as far as I can remember back. I mean, the earliest thing I can point to is that Michael Jackson's Thriller music video. And I had the album prior to that, like on cassette. So I was familiar with the music. And then when the music video came out, I was like, this is super scary and I'm terrified of this, but I love this music. And so I kind of had to reconcile that conflict.
Yeah.
And so I kind of embraced, all things horror and Halloween after that point. But why did I embrace that and other people didn't? I mean, everybody heard Thriller in the 80s. And so not everybody.
Can you remember it like that being that impactful? And like,
his eyes, his cat eyes, especially the first transformation scene in the woods when he looks up and says, go away. And then he's got the cat eyes and the fangs already. That terrified me, as well as the end scene when he seems normal again with his girlfriend and then turns around for the closing shot and he has the cat eyes again. And that just freaks me out.
Yeah.
I wasn't like creeped out at all by like the zombies and the raising of the dead, all that. But that transformation really freaked me out.
Please tell me that you learned the choreography and did it at one point.
Of course. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
There'll be a link to that in the show notes.
Right.
I think I know where Marie was going, because I personally am not a fan of horror, but I do. There was a film tent at a festival once where they were talking about almost the psychology of horror, or at least the sociology of horror, the darker things. And it seems like it's just a more honest way to approach the world as far as, but the fact that you were 3 or 4 or 5, you weren't necessarily responding to like the darkness of the world. It titillated you in a way. You used words like I was terrified or I was, but not necessarily a typical good adjective for how people feel.
Mm-hmm.
And yet by being terrified, that's an entertaining emotion for you.
Yeah. I think, and even now, I mean, judging horror movies, once in a while, I'll get scared from like a cheap shot in a horror movie, like a jump scare or something like that. I've watched enough horror movies; it's kind of predictable of when they're going to happen, so it doesn't have too big of an impact on me now. But the movies that are like just really like sadistic or just disturbing, that just gets really under my skin, and I'm like not comfortable watching this movie. I enjoy that sensation.
Really?
Yeah, I like being disturbed by film because I recognize, and there's a huge difference though. I recognize that it's fiction, and that's still in my conscious throughout watching this. Because if I watch actual violence, so I remember in grad school at the height of the Iraq War, Al Qaeda kidnapping and beheading videos. I saw one of those online. Not the same experience at all. This was real violence. And clinically speaking, I had an acute stress response. I had like the hypervigilance and increased startle response afterwards for a couple of days. Even just at the sight of like a butter knife cutting like a slice of bread or something, like really kind of got me keyed up again at the memory of like seeing an actual head get cut off. So that's a completely different like reaction to media that's real compared to even like real depictions, but I still know it's fiction, and that's a safe distance to have those emotions. Mm-hmm.
So would you say, I'm curious then about how you personally approach your, and I don't mean to like give you a spoiler, but your imminent death.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
what's that?
So like, how is that experience for you? Because I know that there's a lot of common narratives and experiences across the spectrum of those who are former fundamentalists in terms of that we're really freaked out. We've had a lot of bullshit about hell, planted into us, and we've had a lot of our life spent denying the fact that we were ever going to die. I'm just curious, based on your experience and based on your interest in embracing and like bathing in the darkness of the world, like how does that translate for you personally in terms of looking at your own mortality and your life on earth and fear of suffering, fear of dying?
Sure. I think about it a lot.
Yeah.
I follow a lot of different quote unquote like death pages on social media, whether it's just kind of exploring death rituals in the past of like funeral photography and like I think they're called like the Thanatos archives or something like that during the Victorian era, where it's very common to take photos of deceased loved ones as a way to kind of memorialize them. And then like the Order of the Good Death and some of the death positive movement I'm really interested in and follow along with. And I also teach a psychology of aging class in which I devote a significant portion to kind of like death and dying and everything. But for my own mortality, I'm not immune from death anxiety. I enjoy living, making the conscious decision that existence is better than non-existence.
Yeah.
And, as best as we can wrap our heads around what non-existence is, it's always been kind of like a terrifying concept. I remember when I was really little, again, probably kindergarten, first grade, maybe around that age. One of my biggest phobias was, it's not even a phobia because it's not even objects, it's just a fear, was thinking about infinity. And for like death for me at that time was just thinking about being in a coffin underground for eternity.
That is fucked up.
I didn't really even think about like, I didn't think about like enjoying heaven or what that looked like. I just thought like people go on the ground and then you hear these concepts of eternity or infinity. And I was like, what does that look like? You're just like existing and it never, ever ends. And that used to like freak me out. And this is what I used to think about falling asleep. And this always sounds like me, like watching horror movies very young, thinking about death. Like I had this very traumatic childhood. like my childhood was like Leave It to Beaver. I mean, my parents were like very nurturing and like loving and unconditional support and all this. I did not have a bad childhood. So this was all just an interesting genetic combination with me that's kind of drawn and to these topics and thinks about them a little bit more. So I think the most that I fear about death now would just be the pain associated with it. Specifically breathing cessation. That's actually my biggest fear with the dying process of not being able to breathe. Sometimes I get dreams like that where there's maybe like some actual apnea happening or something, and it's difficult for me to breathe, or I'm dreaming about having like 25 sticks of bubble gum in my mouth. And it's just like, it's challenging to get some air, and that's like very, very terrifying.
Can I imagine then that you are probably pro death with dignity?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I don't know that I was against it or anything, but with my cat being extremely ill this last month and us having to put her down, like that was enough for me to project onto all beings that it is the compassionate thing to do, to die with, I don't know if dignity is the right word, but it's what's being used right now. But with suffering, we could have let her just wait until all of her body just shut down and she was sick as fuck. Or, you know, let her go when it's, you know, we calculated that this was the best time to do it. So I find that interesting.
And as humans, we can make those decisions for ourselves and like plan for that if we're not able to make that decision once our bodies do start deteriorating.
And I wish that there were more conversations about that and like getting this shit into law, because there's people just suffering all the time, just waiting weeks and weeks, dying slowly. And it's just shit. It's horrible. But anyway, that's a whole other thing, but I'm very passionate about that given my cat this week.
Yeah, but it's similar and it's related to everything that we're talking about. Like this death phobia and this death avoidance is very similar to how we treat sexuality. It's just this thing that exists, and one of the few guarantees in life that we completely avoid. It's just a taboo, and there's so much stigma attached to it.
I know.
So what do you think happens to you when you die?
Nothing other than the physical decomposition of our bodies. But in terms of any type of spirituality, nothing. I believe in non-existence. It's going to be very similar to what life was like for me prior to 1981. So
that
was a very non-memorable time in my life.
So one last thing about, I looked up death positive, which, by the way, we're going to be talking about sex positive and death positive. And these are two things that religion intensely and intentionally try to suppress and not talk about, and kind of, well, I think they live in denial about both of them. They created an immortality project so that they don't have to die. Even the whole scripture says that, you know, John 3:16, that whosoever believes will not perish, but have everlasting life. So they denied death. And they deny their sexuality, like it's, you know, obviously anti-masturbation and anti-premarital and all of that. And here we are, literally on the other end of the spectrum, trying to talk more about both. And so, but I found this this poster graphic that says, "I believe that the culture of silence surrounding death should be broken through discussion, gathering art, innovation, and scholarship."
Oh yeah, I think that's from the Order of the Good Death. I think, or something similar to that, right?
Yeah. And one last thing about Satanism, because the thing is that I did, you know, enough reading. Oh, by the way, I read Anton LaVey when I was a teenager. I was a radical Christian, and somehow got hold of, you know, pieces or excerpts from the Satanic Bible, and oh my God, I loved it. And I was like, I'm not supposed to like this,
right?
Okay, so. You have Christianity. They create, well, and I guess, and more so, just all the Abrahamic religions. They create this character, this Satan, this fallen angel, this antithesis of God, and it's almost like a person comes along and says, "I don't like your religion, and so I'm going to literally borrow your antagonist and adopt, you know, he and his persona, or at least his values, which are passion, pride, liberty, and heroic rebellion." And so when we say I'm going to borrow the name Satan, then it's the dumbass. I mean, the people that say, "Well, you believe in Satan," and no, I'm just borrowing your imaginary friend or enemy, and it's, I don't know, it's just a way of, I don't know, kind of saying fuck you. I mean, it's a way of borrowing their own nonsense and making a a symbol or an icon of, like I said, heroic rebellion and freedom.
Right. It's certainly, it's an inversion. It's an inversion of what is culturally appropriate and acceptable. And I've always liked that kind of challenging. And I think Satanism, at least modern atheistic Satanism, really embraces that. And at least with the Satanic Temple, much more so than the Church of Satan, really weaponizes that politically. And everything that we just accept as just either like fact or taken for granted without questioning, the Satanic Temple really kind of inverts those messages, inverts that the whole metaphor of religion to get people challenged, or to challenge ideas about this Christian supremacy that we have. And I on board with that 100%.
Yeah,
me too. I think I might be an inversionist, because I just love it. I love flipping everything on its head, and we even call it like devil's advocate, as far as just, okay, but what about this? Have you ever read the philosopher or public intellectual Zizek?
I don't believe so.
Okay, well, he's just famous for the opposite is true. He just always is turning things on its head over and over again, almost like a sands of time hourglass. Just about the time you think, oh, we've flipped this on its head, and now we have the truth, and then flip it again, and again and again. It's just a way of, like you said, revisiting and looking at things from a different angle, as opposed to assuming certainty about one's right opinion on this, or stance on this certain subject.
Let's talk about your career. So you work at the University of Minnesota Mankato.
No, Minnesota State.
Okay,
yeah, so
that's different?
Yeah, so this gets confused all the time, even by applicants.
My bad.
Yeah, so there's the University of Minnesota system that has like the Twin Cities campus and Duluth and all that. And then there's a separate Minnesota State system.
Okay.
And Mankato is like the flagship campus. And then there's another one up in Moorhead.
Okay.
And so it's Minnesota State University.
Okay, thanks for correcting me. Okay, so you're a professor there of human sexuality. You have several different specialties that sounds like that you are researching, examining sex work stigma, the effects of sexually explicit material, older adult sexuality, which you talked about a little bit already, and the intersections of sexual health and genital piercings. So my question, what I'm most curious about is, how did you end up getting into this field, and what about it drives you? What makes you passionate about this? What makes you go onto Twitter all every day and write really awesome shit all the time and get lots of people really angry? So
for my career trajectory, I think it was always just having an interest in sexuality. And I think kind of going back to our conversations of where did this interest in like gothic or dark things kind of emerged. It was always there, but in high school, it started becoming a little bit more political for me. And I started recognizing like injustices and why can't we talk about certain things and other things are okay. I was your typical like antagonistic, like goth kid.
Yeah, I hated
high school.
you guys in high school. But now I think you're amazing. Yeah.
And so in my high school, or I think most high schools in the late 90s, like the popular clique was all into like Abercrombie and Fitch, and we just kind of had the general like preppy label for them, even though they didn't really dress preppy. It was more just Abercrombie kind of aesthetic. And just seeing all the hypocrisy and double standards and how they were treated at school versus how I was treated for wearing black and having nail polish occasionally and black eyeliner and taking photos of, roadkill for my photography class and getting called down to the principal's office for that because they thought I killed a cat because I was part of a cult. And so like this satanic panic is certainly not new to me. This has been going on my entire life. Yeah. So out of that adolescent kind of rebellion and kind of questioning authority and what we kind of take for granted or just accept as normative in our culture, it was also mixed in with sexuality too, of how we talked about sexuality, what are our sexual norms, why are some things prohibited, and the reason behind that. And usually there's not much of a logical reason or reasonable reason. It's usually religious in nature, or at least a leftover from religious beliefs and prohibitions around sexuality. So I've always kind of had that interest in sexuality and sexual health. And it wasn't until college, undergrad, I believe my sophomore year, I took a human sexuality class. I was at the University of Cincinnati. at the time, huge lecture hall. There's like 450, 500 people in this class. And that's when I really learned, well, one, everything that I thought about or thought I knew about sex was incorrect or a partial truth or some type of myth, scare tactic, things like that. So that was the first real honest education I got about sexuality. And then two, I was like, oh my goodness, this can be someone's career. And so I looked at that professor as like, wow, he has this amazing career where he can dispel all of these sexual myths that are just ingrained in each one of us, as well as just as a whole, culturally and socially. And from that point on, I wanted to do that professionally.
So it sounds like the truth drives you.
It does, but also kind of shaking things up. So it's similar to my experience on Twitter that I'm, it's a public account and it's my professional identity attached to it. And so I'm very intentional with what I tweet. It's not like just off the top of my head and then I think only my friends are looking at this. And so that's what's funny when I get some backlash and somebody, some right-wing troll or somebody is going through my account and say, oh, look what he tweeted 2 years ago. I was like, yeah, I stand by that still.
Yeah,
I know what I was.
Trump shit?
Right, I know what I was doing, and so that it's intentional, just to kind of poke and provoke, and to kind of get those reactions. And so that's just kind of like the provocative interest that I have, but also to get people to think differently. And that's always the primary goal for even my sexuality and my sexual health classes is, we have all these formal learning objectives that you're going to learn from just interacting with the content. But my more abstract, important goal for me is just to have you think differently about sexuality, usually much broader than you are in the first day of class than you are in the last day of class.
Something that really made me laugh was that I read an article, because you and we ended up talking about scheduling this before that one tweet about Mary not giving consent went viral.
Right.
And so when I was researching, getting ready to talk about this, I found all that stuff and I was like, oh, cool. So, and then there was one article that one of its sources was rateyourprofessor.com. And it was quoting students who rated you poorly and then quoted them. And it was the two ratings that they actually quoted were he has no respect for the tradition of this country. And they were both tradition. I'm like, that's not like actually a complaint. Like I'm reading that and I'm like, thumbs up, like way to go.
And the thing with Rate My Professor was that those negative evaluations came after the Fox News article, so they weren't students of mine. They were people just logging in, just trolling.
Assholes,
yeah,
really?
Prior to the Fox News article, I had.
So does this get to you at all? Like all this attention, this negative attention that you're getting, or do you just feel as a white man like very like resilient and you don't even fucking care? Or, like,
I care because it's conflicting emotions.
Yeah.
On the one hand, yes, this is what I am intending.
Yeah.
I am intentionally provoking and poking, expecting that this could be the response from some. And then the little neurotics, not little, it's a huge part of me. The neurotic, anxious side of me is like, oh my goodness, this random person in Massachusetts who's leaving me this angry voicemail doesn't like me. What do I need to do to kind of get them on my side? And so that's more obviously the irrational side. That's my anxiety. Just kind of talking. My need for approval from everybody, even though what I talk about, that's not going to happen.
Never.
So yeah, it's still, it creates some conflict with me. On one hand, it's a source of pride. The other hand, it can be pretty anxiety provoking, and especially if it's kind of like a tsunami that happened after it was on Tucker Carlson. I was just getting like hundreds of hate mail and things like that. So when it hits like that, it can be a little unnerving, just because that's the only message that I'm hearing. Like, I'm a piece of shit, I'm a cocksucker, or die of AIDS. And like, hope you get,
that's a lot of homophobia.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah, a lot of homophobia, a lot of anti-Semitism. I'm not Jewish, but
I was like, are you Jewish?
No.
I just wanted to use the opportunity to say bad things about Jews, because why not?
Yeah, and it is tied. So I've received this kind of hate from, they're typically Catholic white nationalists on Twitter, and their avatar is, or their profile pic is like a knight from the Crusades or something like that. So they fetishize the Crusades and everything. And I'm used to interacting with them because they just like troll with like memes. The little Shrek meme with the fedora is like an anti-atheist kind of meme. I had to look that up once I started having all my mentions with like Shrek. I was like, what does this even mean? And so they use a lot of anti-Semitism in their speech and even directed at me. I don't know if they think I'm Jewish or that's just an insult for them, saying anything related to Judaism. But one thing that is interesting is that they think like sexual like revolution or being liberal with sexuality or being a progressive with sexuality is part of a Jewish conspiracy. And so that was news to me over the past year that there's conspiracy theories.
It makes me like the Jews a little bit.
Right.
More,
yeah.
like...
And so it's like maybe they're thinking, oh, only a Jewish person would have these kind of thoughts about sexuality.
Yeah,
so therefore,
I don't get it.
there.
So I started to ask you if you've ever had a visit from the dean or a cease and desist, but I imagine the provocation probably increases your enrollment. I mean, kids want to be in your class.
Right. And that's the interesting thing. So well, I'll back up a little bit. There was one thing that I tweeted about last, I think, Lent. I think it was on Ash Wednesday. I said, on Ash Wednesday, consider giving up these following things for Lent. And I had just a bunch of lists of like sexual shame, the concept of sexual sin. But then I also included white nationalism and white supremacy, and then also Jesus. To give up. And the white supremacists, probably like searching white nationalism or something to see who's talking about them, found that. And usually they'll screenshot it and take it to 4chan and then get their little white supremacist crowd all riled up. And then it comes back to Twitter. Some of them contacted the university, but I don't think it left our psych department. I don't think it left our office manager, and she just kind of laughs at them. And and whoever runs the Minnesota State Twitter account, I contacted them before, just being like, hey, just in case I see you're tagged in some of these, so just so you know the context where this is coming from. And they were like, oh, I've seen much worse. This doesn't matter. And so historically, it hasn't really been an issue. This past December, once it was on like Breitbart and everything else that it circulated through. Yeah, they started contacting the dean, the president, threatening to withhold donations, even though they're not donors. So these are all just like empty threats. These are just random people kind of threatening the university, trying to get me fired. I guess it went through our diversity office at some point. So apparently somebody thought like this was hate speech, and which always, that pisses me off the most, this belief that criticizing those in power is like hate speech. It's like, well, you can't, punching up. You can't criticize white people, Christians, men. They're the ones that are holding the power. And so criticism is not hate speech, right? That's punching up those. That's just critiquing those in power and institutionalized power. And so, and they saw it similarly. So even though there was a lot of meetings at the university that I wasn't a part of, I just kind of heard after the fact. It didn't result, obviously, in anything. I'm protected under freedom of speech. And what was comical, that I'm also protected under freedom of religion, because now Minnesota State thinks I'm an actual Satanist because of some of the photos that Fox News was sharing of like my Christmas tree and my Baphomet. So that's fun that I'm at least protected as this quasi-Satanist on campus.
So I'm curious, like, is anyone actually trying, like, you got such a reaction from this tweet in December, like, is anyone actually trying to talk to you about it, or are they just being assholes on Twitter? Well,
everyone thought that they had the quick, like, gotcha kind of rebuttal of just quoting the passages from Luke about the story of Gabriel, the angel of Gabriel visiting Mary, and that was supposed to like be the consent discussion. And I was like, yeah, I grew up with these stories. I've watched the Charlie Brown Christmas special. I know the Gabriel story. I'm not like ignorant of that, the whole Christmas story. Yeah. But that doesn't change my point of the power difference between mortals and gods, and that's the whole point I was trying to make. And so, yeah, most of it was just quoting Luke as saying, "You're a dumbass. You should know, a little bit about the Bible before bashing it," and be like, "Well, I know about this." And then the others are just ad hominem attacks.
Well, I want to jump right into the sexual stuff because I want to sit down on the sex couch for a second and ask a question.
What the fuck is a sex couch?
Well, he's a therapist, right? Or at least he's in the field of psychology.
We're doing like a Freudian thing right now.
Well, so I love porn so much that I think I'm a voyeur of some sort. Just watching people have sex is like one of the greatest things about being alive. However, I found that the couple of times, and I know some of this is my Christianity, but the couple of times that I've been to a strip club where I'm within feet of a naked woman that's a stranger, I am completely uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. So when I'm safely behind a screen, anonymously, or what is it when you're incognito watching, I'm fine. I mean, I have the opposite of anxiety, but if I'm in the same room with a naked stranger, freeze up.
Sure. Oh, you want me to analyze that?
What's wrong with me?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what necessarily is going on with you individually, but yeah, I mean, that's a common reaction of just the closer that we get to explicit depictions of sexuality. And for some people have that reaction just seeing it on a screen, right? And that they can think about it comfortably, but when they see it visually, then that's when they become uncomfortable. And for others, I mean, thinking about it creates that anxiety. And so it's just kind of like anything with sexuality, of viewing it on a spectrum, viewing it on a continuum. You just kind of came up to your point that it's creating some discomfort for you. And that just happens to be the real life individual, stranger in this commercial sexuality establishment. So,
yeah. Mm-hmm. So would you recommend immersion therapy to move my threshold of comfort further up?
You can do whatever you want to do. I'm not providing you therapeutic advice on a podcast.
No, I just need to go to strip clubs more and more so that I'm more comfortable.
That's obviously
right.
The
That's
answer,
that's the take-home message.
Yeah.
Well, my big message in my sexual health classes is always just, it's your body, do as you choose. And so whatever you want to do.
So the cat just showed up, and that's distracting me, but she's adorable.
She's super cute, rubbing up against me.
Yeah. So we literally haven't even gotten to the sex questions.
Sure.
So I think we talked a little bit about purity culture. I'm interested in having a discussion and hearing your point of view and your understanding of things in regards to what purity culture is, where it comes from, how it affects people. And then I think the most important topic this entire episode, I think for me, is, and now what do we do? Like, how this stuff exists, and now how do we move forward, and how do we heal, with a focus on people who are former fundamentalists and trying to separate themselves from that indoctrination that doesn't just leave just because you don't believe in a God anymore.
Right.
So can you speak to that a little bit?
A little bit. I think one thing that I'll mention is this idea that religion and sexuality is permitted in Christianity, but it's very narrow in terms of what is actually permissible. And so how I view that is always that they're prescribing sex. And it's just how narrow that prescription, or how specific that prescription is, right? Is it just within heterosexual marriages for the purpose of procreation? Everything else is deviant. Everything else is sinful. So on the one hand, they say that they're very sex positive. However, the big asterisk is that, but it has to be within these confines, right? Mm-hmm. And then the more quote unquote progressive aspects of Christianity will just kind of move those goalposts a little bit more, broaden that out a little bit, but it's still prescriptive. It's not this tailor to the individual of what does sexual pleasure, satisfaction, and health look like for you, for an individual. It's these generalizations that are made that sexual health looks like this.
Yeah.
As long as you follow this criteria, then you'll be living a sex positive, a sexually healthy life and a good sexual being as a Christian.
And can you just quickly define, because I see you using the term sexual health, and can you define what that means for you when you say, because when I hear the term, I apply it very narrowly and think about STDs and
Sure.
just basic hygiene. Can you talk more, or at least quickly just address like what you see when you say sexual health?
Yeah. So my use of that is very broad and encompasses a lot of different aspects of our overall well-being and health. Obviously, STIs, the things that we typically think of, being free of sexual functioning difficulties and things like that. But it's also an acceptance of one's sexual identity, sense of sexual self, being able to pursue sexual pleasure, everything that would go into our general well-being and our general health, whether it's physical or mental, is how I think about sexual health, at least from a clinical standpoint.
Sure. No, that makes sense. Totally.
Yeah. And I think going back to your original question of, the effects of purity culture, and I've given just more like academic talks on this topic and the target audience for the talks were atheists or agnostics, former believers, things like that grew up in religious households, had these sex negative messages, whether directly or indirectly. They become very ingrained. And even though intellectually they disagree with them now, these messages, and can think differently, they're still having some of these emotional reactions that can dictate their behavior.
It's kind of like trauma is stored in the body.
Too.
I mean, like the body responds, even though, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's various degrees of that in terms of like, what do we do with that? Sometimes it just requires some repetition of sex education and sex positivity and having these conversations. If it's more surface level, for others, it would meet more of a general definition of a traumatic response.
Yeah.
Not PTSD in the sense that our life was threatened physically. It is oftentimes spiritually, but physically, no. So I'm cautious to use like the term PTSD from a clinical perspective because it has a very narrow definition. Yeah. But using trauma in a general sense of the word, and how that would require more intensive, longer term therapy to really essentially reassociate our bodies with our sexuality, to have some reconciliation, like what you were saying, that disembodiment, kind of having reconciliation with that and decreasing that cognitive dissonance so that we have these attitudes now that's not really matching our response. And how can we reconcile that? And a lot of times that does take longer term therapy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm really interested in, because you mentioned re-educating yourself, getting a refresher on sex education. So what does that look like for, these former fundamentalists who are approaching midlife? Maybe they deconverted a couple of years ago and they're still carrying all this baggage with them. Like, do you specifically have any ideas of like how people can re-educate themselves in a very specific way? Like, I know that, you can go to therapy. There are sexual health clinics and people you can talk to. Are there resources out there that you would recommend for people like that?
I wish I came prepared for that question because there are. No, that's fine.
You can put them in the show notes later if that's a question that you want to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I can. There are definitely, and I'm terrible when someone says, "Hey, do you have a good book recommendation?" I'm not putting this on you. Yeah. Do you have a good book recommendation or a website? Be like, yes, I just don't remember it right now because it's like bookmarked, on my laptop. Totally. So yeah, there are websites, and actually, I was just updating this for my sexual health class that I'm teaching that starts on Monday. So if you want to engage in more of the content beyond just the lecture videos and the assigned readings, here are some websites to really explore and to check out. So yeah, a lot of that exists, and I can send you later some of those the links that could be helpful for listeners. But yeah, it's just engaging in those. And this is the therapist, the clinical psychologist in me, always kind of pointing this out, that as you're engaging in some of these educational websites or resources, just really monitoring how you're feeling about that, like what comes up for you. Is it still feelings of shame or guilt or embarrassment, some type of unease in some way, and kind of reflecting on where do you think this is coming from, and how can I self-soothe in the moment so my body starts reassociating being exposed to positive depictions or descriptions of sexuality, and my body is responding in a more of a positive way, or at least in a neutral way that's not having a negative response.
Yeah, it sounds like in a word you're talking about mindfulness.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been key for me for sure. Just noticing what's popping up for you and trying to put some words on it.
Yeah.
And then once you have those words, saying, why?
Right.
Why is that there?
Yeah, so this is another level of trauma other than the purity culture. We had a guest on the show within the last year who was molested by her father on a weekly basis for 4 years, like from the ages of 12 to 16 or something. And she obviously had a ton of sexual hangups well into her adult years. And Christianity kind of stunted that, or arrested any healing that might have been able to occur through those decades. But so when she got out of Christianity and she began truly trying to address her, her sexuality and the wounds and the trauma and get some healing, and I'm not sure if this was prescribed or this was on her own, but I think the first time that she saw pornography where the women were enjoying themselves was just, shocking to her. Like, they like this, and of course, sometimes they're actors and, it doesn't matter, but,
Right.
But it was, she did do immersion therapy in that she watched, certainly healthy, pornography that was non, violent or whatever. But to just immerse herself in believing that this is something that maybe someday she could too enjoy. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with overcoming or managing a body's traumatic response from either a single traumatic event in one's life or multiple traumas throughout the person's life, is that treatment is very individualized. And so we can't, from a clinical perspective, can't make these generalizations of, oh, you want to overcome these traumatic things that have occurred to you, and this is how it's affected your sexuality, then do X, Y, and Z. Right. So that's not going to be the case. Everything within therapy is so individualized of what do you think is going to work for this individual. And that emerges through, comprehensive assessment and building rapport with that individual, kind of knowing which direction therapeutically to take that would be the most beneficial. And sure, some individuals, like the person that you were talking about, could find some benefits, some healing from exposure to various descriptions or depictions of sexual behavior to kind of rewrite the narrative. And a lot of therapy, even a lot of counseling, sometimes that I do is just providing validation and providing permission that this is okay. You can engage in this, right? Because they've never received that message. They received the opposite their entire life. You can't do this. This is bad. Yeah. Or I'm going to tell you what we're doing, right? And so it's really giving them agency, determining what is right for themselves, and just even explicitly just granting them permission to explore that for themselves.
Do you find that maybe that there's a lack among the therapist community of understanding and or being competent in understanding the role that religion plays in sexual / spiritual abuse? Do you know what I mean? Like, the people I've talked to, because this is me we're talking. I'm not speaking hypothetically. Yeah. This is me. Like, the people I've talked to are like, they just don't understand it. And I end up having to get myself out of it, which is fine because now I'm strong as fuck.
Right.
But it's very discouraging. And so I'm just curious, in your experience, do you feel like there is a need for therapists to be more educated or more competent in how religion can affect your sexuality and your comfortability or your own self-validation and autonomy?
Absolutely. Yeah, there needs to be increased competency with just anything related to sexuality, especially in the intersections between sexuality and religion.
Yeah.
And it's, looking back at my graduate training, So a doctoral program for me was 5 years, and this was after undergrad. And the amount of time devoted to sexuality, I think, could have been condensed down to maybe 30, 45 minutes over those 5 years in terms of formal instruction or training. Granted, I had this interest going into graduate school, so I made it a part of the curriculum. Like every presentation I was given, I made it a sexual health topic of some sort. I sought out clinical opportunities within sexuality. But in terms of what was part of the formal curriculum, it was really just a brief lecture on DSM diagnoses of the sexual disorders at that time. And
so disappointing.
So that's it. So I certainly wasn't a competent therapist to be addressing sexuality topics right out of grad school. And so then I went into like a 2-year specialized training program for it. But therapists aren't getting that. Most therapists are just generalists and just have maybe that part of a lecture or two during their graduate education, and maybe took one continuing education workshop or something on this topic. And that's it. And that's really kind of a therapist ethics kind of issue of kind of know thyself, know your limits. And if you're up against something that is outside of your area of competency, say so. Say so, get increased training, get supervision if you want to continue working with this person.
And then that mirrors back to me the competence and the advocation that you have to do on your own as a client of a therapist. Because I remember at the point where I was like, okay, I have some severe religious bullshit I need to deal with, and I just moved, so I need a new therapist. And so calling around and finally, picking up that phone and being like, yeah, such and such therapist, I need to work out some shit on religion. Can you handle that? And not apologizing for my needs and, asking for what I needed from the therapist. I think often we think that therapists know everything, and that we're just supposed to, it's that authority thing. We're just supposed to subject ourselves to that authority. I fight with my therapist all the time. I'm like, no, you're wrong. Like I disagree with that. Thank you for the insight, but I disagree with you, and that's fine. And so anyway, tangent, but yeah.
No, that's very important. It's unfortunate that so much of that is placed on the clients of psychotherapy to really have to be self-advocates in order to get the kind of care that they want. Therapists can, list a lot of different things on their websites or a Psych Today kind of profile or something like that that would maybe communicate that they're competent in a certain area or inclusive of a particular demographic or something like that. But it's not going to necessarily be an exhaustive list. And so it still requires a lot of kind of screening from clients, asking therapists certain questions. And a lot of clients don't even know necessarily what's going to be a good fit for them. Unfortunately, especially if this is maybe their first go at therapy.
Right. And that's why I'm really grateful for different sites out there that promote the therapists with even beyond Psychology Today, like that promote therapists with specialties. For example, there's I would definitely want to call attention to Secular Therapy Project, because they therapists can put their names in there as, now therapists that you can talk to that will promise not to give you woo and bullshit. And then there's also, and I can't remember the name of the website, but there's a website for therapists who are versed or competent in talking about alternative relationship structures. So it's like a poly site, and that's where I found mine, and she's fucking amazing. And I don't know that I would have found somebody who was competent in that. Like, you're talking about 30 minutes talking about sex. What was there 30 seconds where they talked about poly? I have so much to talk about. Oh my God. How many hours are you here for? Oh, Cass, what do you got?
Well, pornography ended up being my quote unquote downfall. And as a Christian, I fought it tooth and nail, but I was a fairly regular viewer of pornography and reader of erotica. So anyway, I've been exposed to it my whole life. A couple questions. Is there such a thing as a porn addiction? And then secondly, what are your thoughts and feelings about the point of diminishing returns, or something to where if you watch so much porn that it desensitizes you to it can begin to affect the bedroom, your real life sexuality, even to the point of like impotence or something?
Sure. So with porn addiction, so where I like to start with talking about any, like whether it's porn addiction, masturbation addiction, sex addiction, things like that, is one, we have to kind of clarify the language that we're using, because that's usually the big part, of at least the clinical and research debate about it.
And I get the sense that it's overused. I mean,
Right. And usually it's a self-diagnosis, a self-label. People will enter therapy saying that they're a porn addict, that they're a sex addict. And then it's not like a therapist is just saying, oh, no, you're not, go away. Obviously, there's distress there. Obviously, it's having some type of impact in their life. And so where I'd like to start with this conversation is recognizing that, or at least asking the rhetorical question, can sexual behavior, including porn use, become problematic in somebody's life? And I think everybody can agree that, yes, it can, right? For a certain individual, depending on their circumstances, it can become a problem. So now the debate then is just what causes that? What do we call it? And then what's the best course of treatment? And that's where the debate within the clinical communities and research communities really rests. Mm-hmm. So what we're seeing clinically is usually individuals who have a conflict between their sexual behavior, whether that's porn use or non-porn use, and their sexual attitudes and sexual values. And that's creating the distress internally, and that can warrant treatment in and of itself. And that's not necessarily indicative of any type of like sexual disorder. That's just oftentimes more of a religious problem. That's a conflict of faith, that they're behaving in behaviors that's not congruent with their spiritual values and how they want to live like a spiritual life. Other times, and often the case in my experience when I was working a lot clinically with this population, was that they were engaging in secret porn use, and it was discovered by a partner, typically a spouse, and usually these were heterosexual couples. And so it was a wife discovering her husband's porn use, and then that created the conflict. Again, not necessarily indicative of a quote unquote porn problem, porn addiction, sexual disorder, anything like that. But right now we have at least a relationship problem that needs to be addressed, usually therapeutically. So again, that's not really indicative of that this individual has like a porn addiction, but their porn use was creating problems for their life. And so when we start looking at it from that perspective, we can be a little bit more cautious when we use that term like porn addiction or compulsive sexual behavior, hypersexuality, whatever we want to call it, because that's really putting the label on the individual. That the individual is disordered, and that is propelling them to engage in these behaviors in an unhealthy way. But oftentimes what's happening is that it's the environment, the circumstances that they're in, that is conflicting with their sexual behavior. Mm-hmm. So if they're in a relationship in which porn use is prohibited, looking at a pornography website for 2 seconds, and that's showing up in the browser history, that's going to become problematic.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody would say that person's a porn addict, but certainly that crossed a boundary in that relationship, whether that boundary was spoken or not. Yeah. And that's often the case, is that these boundaries aren't talked about. And all of a sudden, oh, you're not cool with porn? Oops. And now you have like the secrets that's been going on for like 5 years. And now how do you kind of recover from what is it's a boundary violation in a relationship, betrayal, the loss of trust. Mm-hmm. And then it becomes less about the sexual behavior, just like in-person affair becomes less about the actual behavior and more about the violation of trust that occurred. Mm-hmm. So this is the more nuanced kind of explanation, long-winded explanation of my thoughts on like porn addiction, at least how it comes out clinically. There's not great data to support that prolonged porn use is related to any type of sexual functioning problems like ED, erectile disorder, dysfunction. There's not great data to suggest that there's this tolerance effect like we see with substance use, where, you start off with small amounts of porn, then you get desensitized to that, build up a tolerance. Now you're watching more and more.
Now you have to watch 2 girls to 1 cup to
exactly.
Get off.
Yeah. Watching more like fetish, more extreme, and that's all relative terms too, like what's extreme porn. There's not great data to support any of that, but that certainly is part of at least the mainstream narratives about porn use. And that's certainly part of the narrative of like the scare tactics of the harms of porn, like whether it's the Porn Harms Group, any of these like abstinence from sex or abstinence from porn organizations. that are promoting like no FAP and all that. That they
I don't know what that is.
No FAP group. So no fapping is just a slang term for masturbation. So no FAP is just a movement of guys trying to abstain from masturbation because they buy into the false reports that this is extremely neurologically unhealthy for you and it's going to alter who you are as a sexual person. It's going to prevent you from engaging in healthy sexual behavior in the future with a partner. And one interesting thing about the no FAP movement, or just like this prohibition on porn and prohibition on masturbation, is that, like I was talking about earlier with some of the Twitter backlash, that's interwoven within white supremacist groups too, and really adopting this anti-masturbation and anti-sex stance from more of a puriety, in this case, more of a racial purity, that you can't waste your seed on anything. You need to direct all your energy to like maintaining like the purity of self and therefore purity of race as well. And so, yeah, there's a lot of unhealthy views of sexuality and how that also specifically ties into masturbation and porn use. And one thing, lastly, with porn addiction, at least what I see clinically and other clinicians that treat this pretty regularly also note, is that it's easy to scapegoat pornography as the problem that's going on for either the individual or the couple in the relationship. But oftentimes it's the role of masturbation and fantasy in an individual's life, in their relationship, that's actually the problem, right? Because when you talk with these couples who maybe had a boundary violation about porn, one person's really upset that they caught their partner masturbating to pornography or something. Is it really about what they're looking at, or the fact that they have their solo sexuality, that they are fantasizing? So take away the screen and they're just closing their eyes. How is that different for you?
There's no cache of that.
Right. Yeah. There's no evidence of it. Right. So oftentimes our conversations clinically about porn addiction or porn use or the problems porn is creating in a relationship is actually about attitudes that the individual or couple has about the role of masturbation in a relationship.
And probably the possession of each other's sexuality.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of, understandable insecurity that we all have from time to time with meeting our sexual needs of our partners, of like, oh, if I was meeting all their sexual needs, they wouldn't need this. Right. And so just kind of these myths about what a sexual partner in a monogamous or a non-monogamous relationship is quote unquote supposed to provide the other person. A lot of times those are unrealistic expectations.
Oh, yes. Yes. So I think an interesting conversation to have after this is the idea of, I'll throw three words out there: ethics, consent, and autonomy. Because I think one of the best ways that I've released some of the indoctrination that I've had around sexuality is learning about ethics and like autonomy, in that what I do with my body on my own, like my autonomous choices, they're always, I don't know how to phrase this. It's okay. Like I can make choices for myself and that's okay. So like I would challenge that there's nothing wrong with watching porn. Even if you're in a relationship where your partner doesn't want you to watch porn, it's your brain. You can do whatever the fuck you want. It's your sexuality. There are no boundaries that you're crossing. You're not making them watch porn. So like ethics has taught me about that, and I'm open to being challenged on that. However, but I just, it's been really helpful for me to understand that I have absolute control over my body. And despite the fact that I have a partner, like I don't have to do anything. Like if I don't want to do anything, I don't have to fucking do anything. And even if that means like I'm afraid he's going to go find another partner, which he has, and that's fine. But like you're not obligated to do anything with anyone that you don't want to do. And maybe one day you're going to want to, and maybe another day you're not going to want to. Maybe one day you do with one partner, and then the other day you don't with the same partner. And I think a lot of healing can be found in, and I think you did talk about this already, just like embracing your autonomy and understanding that it is absolutely 100% appropriate to draw boundaries around yourself that are appropriate for you. But those boundaries should belong to you within your territory of your body, and not owning other people's behaviors. Like I would never, at this point with the education that I have, I would never say to my husband, like, you can't watch porn. You can't sleep with your girlfriend anymore. Like, those things don't belong to me. What does belong to me is my sexual health. So it is appropriate for me to draw a boundary and say, like, you need to be careful. Like, you need to be sexually healthy, careful with what you do. But I guess I'm just kind of coming down to this discussion about the ethics of what is okay and what is not okay in expressions of sexuality. And I'm really, really interested in a conversation about consent, because I've seen lots of graphs of, pictures of penises and vaginas, and I know all the things and where all the things are. Right. But at least in the time that I grew up, and I imagine also for you, there was no discussions about consent or communication for people who might be exploring things together sexually. Can you talk? I know I just said a lot, but like, reflect back however you want to.
Yeah, I'll start backwards.
Okay.
So I'll start with the consent piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that consent is being talked about more and being pushed as a necessary and required component of any type of sex ed curriculum. I don't know how much of that is actually being placed into practice in K through 12 sex ed, but at least there's conversations and recognizing the need that it should be in there as part of a core curriculum component. Because if I think of what are sexual secular values, it really is just like three things, and pretty close to what you were saying. It is the bodily autonomy. It is consent, and then kind of more broadly from consent of just knowledge. And this is having access to sexual health information so you can make the right choice for you, and being able to know where to go get birth control, or other aspects. I'm drawing a blank now, but drawing a blank on knowledge, ironically. Other aspects of sexual knowledge that can make an individual the healthiest version of themselves. So with consent being like a separate component of that, because part of that can be under the umbrella of knowledge, of knowing that, let's say you are in a non-monogamous relationship, that everybody knows the boundaries of this relationship structure. And so that's knowledge. And so therefore you are consenting. That's how you get consensual non-monogamy. Otherwise it's cheating and non-consensual. So some of that falls under the knowledge. The pieces that don't necessarily is more relating to the power dynamics within conversations about consent. And this was actually kind of at the root of that Virgin Mary tweet, of just kind of pointing out that power difference. Because I wrote that after prepping for a lecture on consent, where I was thinking about power differences in the real world of, and the ethics behind different power differences and how some are criminalized. And so as a psychologist, if I were to have a sexual relationship with a patient, not only is that unethical, but that's also criminal in the state of Minnesota. That would be considered sexual battery. And the reason why is because of that power difference, that the unique position of that therapist, that having all this information, the client hardly has any personal information on you, and how that therapist can really manipulate that individual, given that knowledge that they have about them, to their own selfish reasons. So that's why that's obviously a power difference and unethical. And then I just extrapolated that to the power difference between gods and mortals, and obviously there couldn't be consent there. So what I like to think about with consent that doesn't get talked about too much, and I just started thinking about this recently, as I started hearing some criticism, with the Me Too movement, of consequences. So are we going to ruin these guys' lives because they engaged in behaviors X, Y, and Z, whatever? So I know, so sad, crocodile tears, right? Yeah. But what's interesting is that those conversations about the consequences of a sexual boundary violation, right? So it violated consent in some way. That what happens to that person, or what could happen to that person, I wonder, and I don't think there's data to support this one way or the other, but I would be curious to know, and it can be done experimentally, is if somebody is like facing maybe expulsion from school, if this was a college student, right? Or they're going to lose their job, or they're going to go to jail because of this consent violation. Does that change the person, an outside person's perception of whether or not a consent violation actually took place? Because now they're pumping the brakes on the consequence. Like, oh, no. I don't think they should be expelled from school. And so then they have to rewrite the narrative of like justifying or watering down or some other kind of reworking of the consent violation to make it less so, because they don't think the punishment is justifiable. Yeah. And so I wonder if we just kind of like, let's place the punishment piece on a different shelf, right? Regardless of what happens to this individual, can we acknowledge that a boundary was crossed, right? And this is also a problem that I've been talking about the past couple of years in my class with in relation to consent, is that we get so fixated on the legal definition, specifically the legal definition of rape, and how most criminal statutes relating to rape are very, very narrow. They just focus on penetrative behaviors. They make a lot of assumptions. It excludes a lot of different types of consent violations. And so if something doesn't live up to that very strict and narrow legal definition of rape, then we're less likely to take seriously other kinds of consent violations. And they're like, oh, no, that's not rape. That person's not a rapist. They did X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, you're focused just on the legal definition, right? A criminal statute. Let's think of consent more from an ethical perspective, right? As opposed to just a legal perspective. Because I've also heard people saying, well, that'll never hold up in court, right? An accusation of a sexual boundary violation, a consent violation. And so I guess that's still applying our legal system, legal guidelines, that a consent violation only really occurred if it can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in the court of law, and therefore someone's going to have a legal consequence. And I don't think, that has its place with the legal system, but consent is much broader than that. And the legal system is not a great guide for anything related to sexuality.
You're dismissing the whole conversation by relying on an authority, which sounds a lot like religion. Yeah. And those individuals who created these laws, not sexual health experts. So I do not trust them creating sexual health policy. So I always try to move the conversation away from our legal framework of what is and isn't a consent violation, and thinking it more broadly of ethics. And when we can start doing that, we can acknowledge how prevalent consent violations actually are, that many, if not most or all, individuals have crossed a line at some point in micro ways. Right? Certainly not a legal definition of anything relating to a sex offense, right? But we passed a boundary, whether we knew that boundary existed or not, or there is some kind of power difference that, again, not an illegal power difference, one that's not necessarily going to get you fired, right? But there could be some undue pressure on the person with less power. And how was that navigated? And we're all taught, and I think all these I don't know if this is a term we are trying to use, but micro consent violations, like we were taught to do them. I think specifically men were taught to do this. Like I just watched, have you been watching The Good Place?
No, I haven't watched that
Okay.
yet.
It doesn't really matter because it's the scene I'm going to talk about is in every movie ever, like all the time. But there's just this moment of like this tense relationship of will they, won't they? And then all of a sudden it's just this very emotional moment where he just goes in and kisses her. And I think they wanted us to be like, oh, finally. Right. And I looked at him like, you motherfucker.
Right.
She never said that was okay. Like you never asked. And that kind of behavior is put out into media as something romantic. Yeah, men are encouraged to just go and kiss her, go and grab her, go to her house and stand outside her window like a fucking freak. Right. And I think this is a huge source of where all this shit's happening. And I think, tell me if I argue if you don't agree, but I think that's maybe a reason why men are feeling really nervous right now, because this is what they were taught, right? And this is what they've been doing, and so maybe a part of them knows that they're already guilty to an extent because they don't know how to do consensual relationships. So can you talk a little bit about very specifically, what does consent look like, and how do you fight against the narrative of consent isn't sexy? Consent ruins the mood.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is this okay? Is this okay? Like,
Right.
how do you work around that in a very practical way?
Well, I kind of challenge that slogan of consent is sexy to begin with, because I don't think
I
consent.
said consent isn't sexy.
Right. But that's,
okay.
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, some of the little slogans of consent is sexy. I challenge that of like, consent doesn't have to be sexy.
Yeah.
It's required,
Yeah.
right? And so whether it's sexy or not, right, is kind of like an afterthought, or is not as relevant as it needs to be there.
Yeah.
Similarly, like with condom use, if condoms for that individual or couple is the best option for them in preventing whether it's STI or unplanned pregnancy or something, putting on a condom's doesn't have to be sexy. It's just, it needs to be there, right, for those individuals in that time. But I'm sorry, go back to the
I was just talking about men being
men being nervous.
Being nervous about how to navigate through consent when we're not educated to be to communicate specifically within sexual situations.
Sure, yeah, and I think gender stereotypes and assumptions put men as initiators, men as kind of the movers, and women in the roles of either just the recipients of that initiation, right? And oftentimes reluctant recipients for the kind of protecting ideas of purity or propriety or things like that. And also kind of pumping the brakes on the movement, right? As they need to control men's desires and men's advances, right? And so you kind of have
maybe
this,
it's cold outside.
Exactly, yeah. And so you have this like cat and mouse game. And I've been asked when I've talked about these issues before in class, I've had students be like, well, what if, a woman is playing hard to get? And it's like, yeah, that's how we are conditioned. And that's the script, that we learn of how to play, of like, don't give in too easy, because then you have all these negative slang terms thrown at you, all these slurs thrown at you. So there may be some of that game playing that we're conditioned to do, but we have to break that, right? And as initiators, even if you quote unquote lose an opportunity to pursue a relationship, or sexual or otherwise, that's just going to be the loss.
Yeah.
Right. And we have to be comfortable with that loss. Yeah. And we can't keep perpetuating these harmful gendered stereotypes of we always have to be the initiators, the movers.
Or if they say no, just keep pushing your
exactly. Yeah.
down.
It's just a barrier.
Urkel. Did you ever watch that show? Family Matters?
Friday night.
He was relentless, fucking stalker.
Right.
Like never took no for an answer.
Right. Yeah, we don't think about it as kids. It's like, oh, he's just trying to get the love of his life, right? And we never view it from the opposite perspective.
Eventually she'll see
that
he's what?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, he's the right guy. He's the nice guy.
Yeah.
And this all comes down to like entitlement oftentimes too, is that I'm entitled to this person, right? And they just don't see it yet because I have these characteristics. I deserve to be in a relationship with this other person. And that's completely ignoring that other person and what they actually want in a relationship.
Yeah, I think a great way to resolve a lot of this is to start to recognize the autonomy of other people and to recognize your own autonomy as well.
Right. And for me, I think you said like, can you like pare down what is like consent? For me, it always comes down to, does this person have an ability to say no? And so not only does that appreciate things that could impair their ability to consent in the moment, like substances, right? Do they actually have the cognitive capacity to consent, right? But that also really addresses the power dynamics that can exist, right? Because if somebody is in a significantly less powerful position, they may not have a full ability to say no without worrying about consequences, whether that's like social consequences, occupational consequences, like getting fired or something like that. In the case of like the Virgin Mary and God, like being killed in a worldwide flood because you upset him one day. So all this would impair that person's ability to say no to sexual initiation. And so for me, that's better than this affirmative consent. I appreciate that, and I know where that's coming from, and I can understand it. But I think that misses the power dynamics, because those without power can still say yes, but are they feeling pressure to say yes? Right. So this is why with child sex abuse, to take a hard turn with that. But oftentimes, and unfortunately, children will have a lot of guilt and shame about their own sexual abuse, victimization, because they agreed, quote unquote, agreed to it and went along with it, and maybe even enjoyed it on a physical level because their body responded with sexual arousal. But that doesn't mean that there was consent, right? That's ignoring that power difference, and why children always say yes to adults, because we condition them to do what adults and parents say.
Yeah.
So a person's ability to say no, for me, is really kind of like that key factor in whether or not consent is present.
Okay.
I got a question. I have, as one who has been reading erotica for decades, I have noticed a surge in around the subject of incest. Like, there's a ton of stories out there where it's almost like become this new hot thing. And for some reason that turns on, I mean, it must be popular. It turns on a lot of people, and I'm repulsed by it. But I had a guy on the show a few weeks ago or months where he just said, he was basically claiming to be, like we said about Satanism or something, just a skeptic and always push back and question. And he was like, well, I'll tell you how far my skepticism goes. And he basically said, what's wrong with incest? And he said, if you're using birth control, the birth defects aside, if it's just recreational, why is it immoral? And I couldn't tell you.
Mm-hmm.
So
do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree with him.
Similar to what we were saying about consent, I would be just concerned if there were power differences within the family. So when I do a lecture on childhood sexual development, I talk about how playful interpersonal sexual behavior is perfectly normative and can be healthy. The only thing that we would want to be concerned about is if there is significant power differences. And so if a 5-year-old has an 8 or a 9-year-old sibling and they're playing doctor or something, does that 5-year-old really feel the pressure to kind of go along with their older sibling is doing? Because again, kind of what we're conditioned to think about, following authority, right? And a lot of times authority is just age, somebody older than us, our parents, our grandparents, even older siblings. And so I would worry about that a little bit.
What about adults?
Yeah, I mean, with adults, it really just comes down to overcoming societal taboos and kind of disgust that a lot of individuals have, and and I've seen arguments that that's kind of evolutionary reaction of kind of this incest disgust to kind of prevent us from trying to procreate with very similar genetic individuals. So it would really just be overcoming those things. But yeah, I mean, when you look at it, can consent exist? Probably, theoretically, right? This isn't the hill I'm going to die on. This isn't going to be my takeaway. I say something similar in terms of sexual contact with animals. When we talk about, animals can't consent, right? And so therefore sexual behavior would be non-consensual with them. But what do we do to animals that is consensual? Nothing. Right. So everything is non-consent. I mean, we eat them.
Yeah, my cat did not consent for me to put her down on Wednesday.
Yeah, I mean, we're making decisions on their behalf.
Yeah.
I mean, we are reproducing them by sticking, if they're larger livestock, sticking our entire arm into their vagina or anus, and killing them it's all for our own benefit.
Yeah.
So are we treating sex differently than other aspects of our interactions with animals? And more likely we are. Again, that's not a hill I'm going to die on of advocating for that, but it is a good double standard to kind of point out, and that it is probably influenced by everything else of it doesn't fit narrowly into what is permissible sexual behavior. And I think the more that we can engage in these conversations in a progressive manner and just be guided more by the principles of knowledge and consent and autonomy, we can broaden that prescription, so to speak, now way out, that it can be individualized to what's best for a specific person.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, but I didn't want to do it on air because it seems self-degrading to ourselves and our podcast. So I was going to be like, so why did you agree to do this? You know, because we did that. We asked Betty Bowers' creator, Andrew Bradley. We're like, because that was one question I asked him. I was like, so why are you doing this?
Right, why are you here right now?
Because like you've got like 200,000 followers on YouTube. Like, why are you even giving us the time of day? And like, I think it was similar to what you're saying. Like, he has a passion for like the secular community or the former fundamentalist community, and like recognizes that his work is impactful for that. And so it's a huge privilege to be able to talk to you. I really enjoy the stuff that you're putting out there, and I hope that this is what you were hoping for.
Yeah, this is great.
Good. I'm so glad.
This is the first time I've talked publicly and openly about the whole Twitter Virgin Mary thing.
Oh, really?
The only request for interviews I was getting was from the right wing, and I just ignored all those.
That's what I was going to try to ask you. Like, so literally, like, nobody wants to talk to you and like get to know more about, because like I was like, oh my God, we got to talk to this guy. I love this stuff he's putting out. And I was going to tell you, once I decided that you were cool, I was going to say, I was going to tease you because I already made that joke like a year ago. Not that it's like a novel joke, but I make a film once a year. So I just like fiddle around on film. Me and my husband are in photos and video and stuff. So last year I made a film. I have to send you the link because it's about this woman who was like molested by her dad as a child. And then now she's a stand-up comedian. And so she used a new stand-up routine and invited her dad to be in the audience and then like called him out on his child incest.
But as I was saying, Christmas was an amazing time. The narrative really resonates within me. And personally, I deeply identify with Mary. You know, so sweet and innocent. And then her dad fucked her without consent. Yeah, millennials. You guys are all about your consent and not raping minors.
I think talking about this, what we started off with, I think that's just that incompatibility between spirituality and physicality could go in a couple of different directions. More concretely, where I've gotten myself into trouble with my in-laws, tweeting about Jesus's morning erections, and how that creates a lot of negative feelings among believers and even among non-believers, because it's just so much of a blasphemous thing to say.
So your wife's parents are religious?
Yes. Yeah, I think more Lutheran. And what has occurred to me with like Fox News and the right-wing media of like the satanic panic happened with my in-laws on just a family level. And that's still been going on. Like it's like 3 or 4 years now. Once they started seeing some, at first it was like Facebook posts. So more on like our personal pages, and that they were taking offense to, but it was similar to what I post on Twitter of just kind of like satanic joking around and things like that. But they took it literal, and they couldn't comprehend that somebody could just joke about these things because it's so serious for them. And we were at an impasse for a long time because we didn't have that understanding of just these differences, that they were labeling us devil worshipers, and we were like, well, that would take a devil to believe in, to worship it. So we're atheists. So this is just satanic imagery. This is an aesthetic. And they just thought we were lying. And then I finally dawned on me that we are having, my wife and I, we are having such a hard time understanding how they can't see this as a joke, because that's so foreign and not familiar to our little bubble that we have. Just like they can't see this behavior as joking. Like they don't have that worldview. They don't have that framework that somebody would be just so comfortable with blasphemy in that way. And so I don't think that really helped them all that much, but that insight certainly helped me. Kind of like, okay, this isn't really going to be reconciled in an easy way. And it's created a lot of strain and being cut off from various family members just because I was called the Antichrist by her grandpa, and they believe that we're in a cult. So all these things I was talking about earlier, like that I've dealt with my entire life of just being misunderstood because of having some interests and tastes, that this still plays out in my relationships. Is it the
kind of thing where you haven't been to Christmas or Thanksgiving in a while with them?
It's still ongoing. Like Christmases, no, but the last big to do was last Easter, and we were aware like of the satanic panic. We've been shunned at like Thanksgiving dinners in the past where like family members just won't speak to us and kind of give us the cold shoulder, and we're like, whoa, what's up with this, right?
Is it because I got married in a cemetery?
Right, yeah, and that's part of it. And then she had a black dress, and it's Halloween, and then we like Marilyn Manson and other industrial metal and all of that. And so they think that we're these like boogeymen, these goblins. But what's funny is that they only gather that from social media. And particularly Twitter. And so there's one relative that just always constantly like looks at my tweets and then uses that as evidence as to why I'm a devil worshiper, and shares that with like the grandparents who aren't on social media, and they would have no...
How helpful.
I know, right? And so it's just very inflammatory. What I learned is that this has a lot of like family systems, like origin, and this is just an easy like scapegoat, but it's bringing out a lot of problems that have existed for a long time. So it's not just me, but it's focused on me and my wife too.
Does your wife have siblings?
Yeah, younger brother.
Okay. How does he feel about her and you?
Fine, supportive. Yeah. And her parents now are supportive as well. It's more of like the extended family. But this kind of came to a head last Easter, in which we were kind of getting the cold shoulder treatment again. It was super awkward. It was like a Easter brunch. There's a lot of people there. What we learned later after we left was that an uncle had printed out one of my tweets that mentioned like Jesus's erection, and kind of joking that like, this is fun to mention during like family gatherings, or this is why I'm not invited to like Easter brunch or something like that, right? The joke was that I would talk about that at a family gathering. The factual piece was about Jesus's erection. Nonetheless, was super offended by this, printed it out, and then started showing other people, in the family at Easter. And that's the ironic piece. Is that they get upset over things I say online to a very particular audience, and things that I don't. It's not like I have zero etiquette and go into my in-laws' house and start, praising Satan and, like ripping their crosses off the wall and stuff like that. It's like, no, I'm a normal, respectable human being. We can have a regular conversation. Yeah, unlike them, who are now talking about Jesus's penis at Easter brunch. So that was the
High
fun.
five.
That was the fun irony for me, that they're the ones that made this an issue, and made it an issue for the grandparents too, because they would have no exposure to this whatsoever, because they're not online. At first, when I guess Twitter was trying to be explained to them and where I was saying all these things, they thought I had my own television show that I was saying all these things. And that's when he called me the Antichrist, that I'm on television. I was like, television? What? No.
I'd love to, but
I know,
no.
yeah, I don't have that kind of audience. So they don't even like comprehend or have an understanding of like what Twitter is. And again, I'm not doing this during like family gatherings. I can play nice. I can keep my mouth shut. I can do all those stigma management stuff, hide my tattoos, everything. They're the ones that are bringing family members who would have no exposure to this, because it's not relevant to them, into this drama, just to kind of create some drama.
I just want to call attention to that term you just taught me, stigma management.
Oh, that's a big thing. That's part of my research.
I've never heard of that before. And it's so true. Right away you said it, and I'm like, yep, I do that.
Yep. It's all about deciding to disclose if we have a stigmatized characteristic that's not visible, like that has to be disclosed or discovered, how we kind of navigate that. I mentioned my tattoos, of it's always a conscious decision whether or not I want to show them or not, because there's stigma and I don't want to be judged in a certain way. And like what you mentioned earlier with finding a therapist, I made sure I saw a therapist for myself. Her photo, I could see some tattoos around her wrists. I was like, okay, she has her own. Like she should be okay with mine, because I've been judged by a dermatologist before. I was on.
What the fuck does that have to do with your skin health?
That's what I was asking.
I
was asking because I was on Accutane at the time, because I had really bad acne in the past, and so I was on Accutane. It's a very effective drug, but it's like it hurts your system too. So it takes its toll on you, because it can be used as a chemotherapy drug for certain types of skin cancer too. So it's really, really harsh, but it works well. And so my last session with her, I asked, because I already had tattoos at that point. So I asked, like, when can I get tattoos after this? Because that makes your skin like super sensitive to injury while you're on it. So I wanted to know what the recovery. And she just blew it off by saying,
don't.
Yeah, just essentially that's not a good idea. And not like why or don't do it for, X amount of time.
It's just your body makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, it was totally just an anti-like tattooing kind of thing. And that's actually why I've done research surrounding genital piercings before, because those in the health community have made similar comments to those with genital piercings. Because I'm friends with a piercer at St. Sabrina. So she was telling me all these things of how they've told her clients to remove piercings without any medical justification, just assuming that it's harmful for them in some way, and that they get screened extra for like STIs and stuff, just assuming that because they have body modifications that they must be engaging in like riskier sexual behavior.
Yeah.
And so just stereotyping and assumption making because of body modification. So.
Yeah, it's almost like you need to get to know people on an individual level and stop like judging them based on shit.
Yeah, you would think
that's a lot of work though, so I'm not going to do that.
So all that stigma management of how much we disclose certain stigmatized characteristics to others.
Yeah.
This is more of just a comment than a question, but I over the years, I guess. And this is the thing. I guess I've always just been curious. I got really drawn into Christianity, and it kind of hijacked my curiosity in a way, amongst a lot of other things. But anytime that I would see something like Dr. Ruth had a TV show, and I really appreciated it was a little shocking at first as to how openly she was talking about sex. She would say the word penis or something. It was like, whoa, you can. But just what we call expanding the talkaboutable. I just thought, oh, this is great. And I think it's always healthy. I just, one of the the phrases that we say on this show is say yes to what is. And what I think when people look at the truth and bury their head in the sand, they're saying no. They're saying, I wish this wasn't true. And I wish it so much that I'm going to pretend it's not. And so that, they build their whole life around falsehoods. And I just obviously think it's unhealthy. And this is kind of what you've been talking about with knowledge, is that we know now that monogamy is probably a social construct. And so when your husband does want to look at porn behind your back, it's not he that's wrong. It's that you would expect him, or, that you are jealous, or you take it personal that you're not entirely meeting his needs, and, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of our pain and suffering is a result of just believing untruths about what it means to be human and sexual. The second thing I saw that really, I just lit up about it, and I found out later he's controversial, but the Kinsey movie with Liam Neeson, and just learning that guy existed and that he was really stretching things and expanding the talkaboutable. And then, of course, Dan Savage, I listened to his podcast, and I'm sure these are kind of, I don't know, he's kind of an armchair sex therapist, right?
Right. Yeah, it actually, from my understanding, it started off as a goof that, in a response, kind of an inversion, if you frame it that way, that he was tired of hetero advice columnists giving advice to gay readers. And so he was going to be the inverse of that, being the gay columnist giving advice to hetero individuals and couples. And then it just really took off from there. But.
Yeah, well, he's a lot of fun. And of course, he was just bluntly honest. And I don't know. And I guess in a way, whether we, I was going to say, well, do you like Dr. Ruth, or do you like, all these people? But I think, if nothing else, they're expanding the talkaboutable, and
sure,
can be, overall, it's going to be a positive.
Yeah, it adds to the conversation. It makes it visible. It takes it out of the shadows and the margins, so we can talk about whether, and whether or not, somebody is 100% accurate or very progressive. It's that can all be critiqued. But at least we're having these conversations openly, and that's what I appreciate. And the feedback that I get a lot, both from patients as well as students, is just my ability to talk about sex in a very matter-of-fact way, talking about it no differently than I would ask you, clinically, how many hours of sleep did you get last night? How's your appetite and diet been? How many times a week do you masturbate? Things like that, without skipping a beat. I don't come across as nervous. and I do that intentionally. That's a lot of training that has allowed me to do that. But it's also modeling behavior of how these topics can be approached in a very non-judgmental, value-free, and very matter-of-fact way, just like we're talking about anything else.
Yeah. That reminds me of something that, I don't know. So for people that are afraid of sex, maybe, or at least they're grossed out by it, or they see it as a immoral thing, or shallow. That's a word that comes up sometimes with somebody who's has a high libido or whatever. They equate that with, I guess, slut or just horny. Horny's a degradation, I think, and so I'm all of those things. Like, I have high libido, whatever. And it's funny because the people that are accusatory of my sexual condition say, quote, "You're obsessed with sex." And my observation is, no, you are. Right. I mean, I'm a big supporter of the Hustler T-shirts or whatever that say "Relax, it's just sex." Yeah. So I'm more there, and so I actually make less of a big deal about it than the people that are trying to suppress it. I think that's just my opinion.
Well, sure. I mean, it's the old thought that don't think about a white bear. Yeah. And if you have that direction to people, you're going to be thinking about a white bear, right? And so if you're trying to prohibit from thinking about something, even like thought policing, let alone trying to prohibit behavior, it's going to be a preoccupation, especially if not engaging in those behaviors are incongruent with actually what you would truly desire, but just feel a lot of guilt, shame, or embarrassment if you were to engage in those behaviors. Yeah, that's going to create a lot of distress. And those factors actually create and are kind of the mechanism behind, quote unquote, porn or sex addiction. It's from that distress. It's from those conflicts. It's from trying not to doing something, but then you still have the desire and you do it, but you do it in unhealthy ways. And not necessarily like physically unhealthy ways, but unhealthy that you're not talking about it. You're violating boundaries of relationships. And so just a lot of secrecy goes into it. And that difference between secrecy and privacy. Secrecy is that you're not acknowledging that this exists or this is happening. Privacy is that we know it happens. We're just not like disclosing every time that we masturbate or something, just like we don't disclose necessarily every time we go to the bathroom. But there's no secret that people go to the bathroom. So hopefully to move our sexuality more to privacy as opposed to secrecy. Well,
and I don't think it should go without saying in the context of this show and our audience is that Jesus said, if you so much as think about lust after a person, think about having sex with them, then you've already committed adultery. And so the condemnation is just compounded by that kind of thought police. And this again is part of the, not only the trauma or the low self-image that can come from just repeatedly thinking about something that you're trying not to think about. Anyway, secular people that haven't been given that taboo energy have a better chance of being sexually healthy than Christians, which is, ironic, right? To the degree in which, they would say, unless you're a Christian, you're not sexually healthy. And it's the opposite.
Right. Yeah. I would say that sexual shame serves as a barrier to sexual health for sure. Yeah. And the interesting thing, like the Bible can be whatever you want it to be. And that's why people can choose certain passages that are certainly sex negative, and they use that as justification to condemn porn or masturbation or the LGBT population, denying individuals' rights and everything like that. Or you can select certain passages in which there's like, no, that's just a misinterpretation of the Bible. The Bible is actually very sex positive, and then they point to certain passages and whatever. So you're right, exactly. That's usually one that comes up in that conversation.
Which that pair of people, they weren't even married, but
and
that's a whole other story.
Right. And so the Bible can be whatever you want it to be, but where the early church's decision, Christianity's decisions, were to make it very sex negative. And that's where, at least in our culture, we are currently. So regardless of what it could be, the reality is that's very sex negative. And that's why sometimes I have debates. I try to avoid them as much as possible, but debates with quote unquote progressive Christians who are trying to like reclaim sexuality as part of it. Like it can be spiritual. It doesn't have to be this disconnect. There's misinterpretations of the Bible. Just don't take the Bible literally, blah, blah, blah. All these different like mental gymnastics in order to make Christianity compatible with sexuality. And I can buy into that, but that's not the reality, right? Like I was saying earlier, when you see a cross, that's not a sexualized symbol. When you walk into a church, it's not a sexy place. And even suggesting those things, even among progressive Christians, I would argue, would be viewed as some sort of blasphemy. Because there is still that underlying idea that our physicality, our sexuality is something that needs to be controlled and overcome in order for us to become greater spiritual beings. And so our physicality, our flesh has to be kind of reined in more. And that's the stamp of approval, at least how it's become of Christianity and this culture.
When I was in college, there was a Christian apologist that came to town and he'd rented out like the gymnasium, and he had posters put up all over the campus. I'm trying to remember his name. Anyway, Josh McDowell. And the title of the lecture was Maximum Sex. And his point, I went to the lecture, and actually the place packed out, because of just, how to have maximum sex. And his point was that the most fulfilling sex possible is based on trust. And you're able to be more extravagant or just, let your hair down and just maybe even go wild, reckless, whatever, if you know that in the morning that person's still going to be there. And, you're not used goods. You've saved yourself for that one person, et cetera, et cetera. And this was, his argument was that to have the most fulfilling sex life is the Christian model. What would you say to that?
No.
I would say that is making the faulty assumption that sex is inherently something. So that's something that the language that I use often online is like inherently or innately, because we make a lot of assumptions about particular behaviors as being inherently or innately harmful or healthy or unhealthy, depending on how it fits within our own personal sexual values. And I would argue that sexuality is hardly very few instances in which it would be inherently or innately anything. It's the context.
So it's amoral?
Amoral for a large extent. I would be cautious.
It's something.
Yeah, I would be cautious to say that definitively, because there may be an example that I'm just not thinking of that could challenge that thought. But as often as we think that sex is something inherently is a common faulty assumption that we make. And so this person is making the assumption that sex is the best within these characteristics, or if these conditions are met, right? So in this case, it would be trust, right? And then how do you build a trusting relationship? Well, there's commitment, and that may
you put a ring on it.
Yeah, monogamy or marriage and things like that. So that could be the reality for that person, that in order for that person to have the best sex of their life, these conditions have to be met. They have to trust the person 100%. They have to be committed to them, know the other person's committed to them 100%. It has to be legally binding. I'm not going to argue with that, right? That's their idea. Yeah, that's their idea of their sexual values and what sexual health means to them. Where I have a problem is that when that starts getting prescribed to other people, and thinking it's a universal truth. And that's what Christianity does, and a lot of other religions too, of saying, no, we have the answer of what sexual health is for the entire population. And that's certainly faulty logic for sure. And so the person who says that to have the best sex of your life, you need that trust, it's like, that's just a projection of themselves, because I could easily find somebody that says, no, you know what? Glory holes are the best sex that I've ever had in my life. And so how can you argue with that? You would be like infantilizing them by saying, or condescending by saying, no, you don't know what true sexual pleasure is until you've had that trust, right? So this is just kind of like excitement, or this is lust. This isn't like true sexual satisfaction. And then we're just like putting feelings into like other people, right? We're not taking their word for it.
It's because we want the world to be binary.
Yeah.
And so that's the dominant narrative around sexuality. And the much more complicated question, and the question that we are constantly talking about on Everyone's Agnostic, is that we don't know, like that our experiences are extremely unique. Like the more I talk about sexuality, the less I ask other people Like, I'm like, it doesn't really fucking matter what you do with your sexuality. Or like I was talking to Daryl Ray. He's like, well, your poly your poly definitely looks a lot different than Daryl Ray's poly. He talks in third person, I guess.
Okay.
But and it's so true. So like you can learn what other people are doing, but ultimately sexuality is so much more individual and unique than I don't think any of us ever had realized. And so I'm so grateful for the lives of, like people who are, trans, asexual, LGBTQIA. Did I get all of them? Plus acronym people. I love you guys because they're pushing those boundaries. They're saying like, no, there's more than one way to do this. There's, and especially pansexual people. They're just like, I'm just attracted to whoever the hell I'm attracted to. It doesn't really matter what's going on.
Right.
And so I'm always just like super excited to see them live out their truths, and it is motivating to, at least to me, to find out my own truth and to stop looking, like you said, stop looking for validation from other people saying, oh, it's okay for you to be what you are. It's okay for you to behave this way, identify this way. Instead being like, this is who I am. And it's okay for me to be this way. And I might not be this way tomorrow. I might not be this way with a partner, this different partner, or this other day. It doesn't really fucking matter.
Right.
Like the important thing, like you said, is to be yourself. I think you put it in different words. Just do what you want to do with your body. And like, that answer is like, in a way, like unsatisfying, like, because I want there to be like more of a binary, like a rule to follow, because that takes work.
Yeah.
That takes mindfulness. That takes effort fighting against the disembodiment that a lot of us former fundamentalists struggle with. It means making some amount of peace with your body and saying, I hear what you're saying. Let's go get it, or like, or whatever. And it also means communicating and in a sexual environment. And that is not a thing that we're taught, especially those who identify as women or who raised women. Like, nope. I don't know. I'm on a whole other tangent now, but like, yeah, the world wants us to think that all this stuff is binary and black and white, and it's freeing, and it's not, to know that it's not binary. And there's something, I don't know, that's kind of exciting about that you can express yourself artistically through your sexuality. You can be into one thing one day and try this other thing. And like, you don't have to just be like, I am straight, I am cis. You can do whatever the hell you want. Yeah. There is no label you need to adhere to. And I don't know, I want the audience to hear that. Like, feel free to be you, like, whatever that looks like.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there may not be a nice label for it. And that's what I always talk about. I use myself as an example for my sexual orientation. Just for ease, I typically say I'm straight or hetero, because that's usually what people see when they see my partner. It's a little bit more complex than that, but bisexual or pansexual or anything else doesn't really fit nicely either. I would feel kind of more of an imposter if I started operating under those labels. Yeah. And that's kind of like identity policing in a way that you're not enough of something to qualify for that. And so I recognize that, but there maybe truly isn't a current label that truly captures your sexual identity. And for me, like kind of, I think what you were saying earlier, that can be a little bit of a struggle. And this for me specifically, that I definitely like order and categorization, very logical. I like things nice and neat. And so it can be a challenging sometimes when it's a little bit more abstract, or those things that were nicely contained are now broken. Right. And we view things much broader, and that can be a little unsettling. Yeah. Right. Because there's not an easy, concrete answer or label that we can point to as like, oh, this is this, and this makes a lot of sense for me. It's like, no, this is something that maybe we don't have a label for. Well, we don't have language around.
Right. And there's something to be said that if you view the world, or you at least accept these binary messages that we have, there's some amount, what word? I'm going to use a word and then I might change it. But there's some amount of freedom in that if you don't align with that word, then at least you know it's your fault.
Right.
You know, and whereas now that we're trying to function in a nuanced, non-binary world, there's no fault anymore. Now it's up to you to just float around
Right.
and kind of figure out what you feel, and all of a sudden you have to be with your feelings and there's no one telling you where to go, and that's feels really scary, and that's a lot of freedom. But I think if you can move that way, it eventually becomes less scary, and I think there's a lot of power to be found in that.
This field is definitely a place where Hitchens was right. And religion poisons everything. And what I think, I see all the time, or I feel that Christianity or any kind of religion was created. I think when people move out of the house and it's time to grow up, that it's scary, and so they created the Sky Daddy. And so it's a Sky Daddy, it's a Sky Litigator, it's a Sky King. And so in the case, I have to imagine that if, I don't know, you might be even you, Eric, but a lifelong atheist, like my former co-host, Bob, anybody listening to what Marie just said and what I've been saying is they have to be going, wow. Because in a way, Marie, what you just communicated as revelatory and epiphanal for you, a lifelong atheist or somebody would just be going, you're stating the obvious, and I think for a lot of the world, this is not, it's just a big deal for us to come out from under the Sky Daddy, because there is, logically, reasonably, and even ethically, there is nothing wrong with saying, I'm trans, I'm gay, or whatever, I'm poly. The only thing that makes this a social issue is that the Sky King has prohibited it. And so we, as agents of the Sky King, as deputies of the sheriff, we have to enter society and stop you from doing this, because Sky Daddy is hurt and offended by your activity. That's it. That's it.
Right. And what I find so interesting within American culture is American values of individualism and freedom. And so we all wave the flag for being individuals. We're not collectivists, and we value our freedom. But then on Sundays, we're down on our knees worshiping a king. And we don't really reconcile that difference. And so, like you were saying, it is still trying to look for some type of authority guidance to tell us the difference between right and wrong. Like what you were saying very earlier in the segment, of the sense of justice that we may have, that we are perceiving a lot of injustices. We may be experiencing our own injustices, and the material world cannot deal with that effectively or in a just way. But there's this there's this spiritual justice that as long as we keep doing X, Y, and Z, there will be justice in the end, right? And that provides a lot of comfort. So I understand, obviously, where this is all coming from. There's obviously, too, just a lot of double standards of how we think. And then why I'm so quick to attack it is because the impact that it has on our sexual culture, and how prohibitive and damaging it can be. Marie, with your earlier point of looking for external validation for things, it's the Christian conservatives and the religious right would be the first ones to say adolescents and young adults should not be informing their sexual values from external sources, such as the media and their peers and things like that. But they want their sexual values to be formed by an external source, just their external source, right? So that's just another double standard that we don't really think too critically about, that we would be uncomfortable if somebody's sexual values were being formed by reality TV. But how different is that really than their sexual values being formed by another external source, like the Bible or their Sunday school or whatever their priest or pastor may be telling them on Sundays?
Yeah. So we should probably start working on our Minnesota goodbye, which for listeners just means that you stand at the door for 10 minutes trying to leave, and never, it just takes forever. So what I wanted to just quickly say was, we've touched on a lot of different topics. Is there any topics that we didn't get to, or any main bullet? You're a professor, you make PowerPoint slides all day long. Are there any bullet points or any big topics that we didn't touch on that you just want to briefly just throw out there that we haven't discussed?
I think we discussed everything.
We did it all.
Yeah, my big thing is just, know thyself. It's your body, do as you please. Yeah. And just be guided by some secular sexual values of knowledge, consent, and autonomy. And everything else beyond that, and I could be wrong because this is just still new thinking for me of conceptualizing it and value system is more than likely just someone else's personal values trying to be imposed on you. Because I was having this conversation with another sexual health clinician, and he was asking about secular values, and he had like a list of sexual health principles. And I was like, yeah, those are really great clinically.
Mm-hmm.
But is it really a secular value to say that you have to have like protected sexual behavior every time? Is that really an ethical secular value, or is that more just a health principle?
Yeah.
And I would argue it's more the latter.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't even put the prescription that you have to engage in certain sexual behaviors for your own well-being or health, if that's what you truly wanted to do, as long as you know the risks and consequences that could come about. That's part of that knowledge, and that's part of that consent, and that's part of that autonomy.
Right.
Piece.
That knowledge, definitely. So Eric, we're so glad that you're here, that you came, and we want to kind of segue into some lighter questions.
Sure.
Cass, did you want to take those over?
I got a couple. How did you meet your wife?
We met on OkCupid.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's how I met my husband.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Back in 2012, I was actually in an open relationship at that time. So I was looking for a secondary partner, somebody possibly for a triad relationship structure or something like that. So we met just for coffee, just the two of us, and really hit it off well. And then I think by the second or third time that we met, she started dating somebody a little bit more seriously, a little bit more monogamously. But we were still connecting well, so we just became friends. And so we were friends for 2 years until our relationship structures lined up again when we were both single in, I believe, 2014. And then it was kind of clear that we were obviously very compatible, at least on a platonic level, but there could have been something there beyond that. But that was a risky decision of like possibly ruining the friendship if we try something more. But I think I asked her out, so to speak, when we were just out to dinner one night, and I said, we should be dating, right? Just kind of a little jokingly way, just kind of gauge like her response. She was like, yeah. And then we started dating ever since. Got married a year later.
That's really sweet.
Yeah.
Oh.
One more, I guess we often ask people about their tattoos, and you probably have too many to unpack, but like, I don't know, what's your favorite tattoo that you have?
I can't really do favorites. I'll talk about the one that I just got last night. Got fresh one.
Okay.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so still has the little ointment on it, and the where you can see this on my forearm, the waxing job I did on my forearm hair from removing the bandage tape this morning. So that's going to be fun growing that back out. But this is actually to commemorate. I was actually going to get this prior to the whole right-wing media frenzy that happened to me over the winter.
Yeah.
But this is just kind of a way to commemorate it too. This is a symbol. It's known as the sigil of Lucifer. It first showed up in a spell book in the 13th century, and it's just used to invoke the devil. So that's the meaning behind the symbol, and the design of it has some specific meanings, why it's related to like magic or whatever. And it's just kind of made out of vines or roots that I have all over my other tattoos as a way to kind of connect them all.
That's so cool.
Yeah,
so can you tell us about the ones on your, because I'm looking at them and it looks like there's like, you're looking at the roots of a tree, except it's just like but there's like skulls growing on the roots.
Yep, this is human evolution. So this is the human evolutionary tree starting up here with Australopithecus.
And
so
then those
it
are
just
all the
goes,
different skulls.
Yeah, like this is Neanderthal, the one closest to the bottom. But then you have like Homo erectus and Homo ergaster. I got Homo habilis up here on my shoulder.
Cool.
And yeah, so the roots and the vines are kind of like just showing the connection of it, and eventually kind of goes down to nothing. I haven't decided what I want to do lower.
You want to get a full sleeve, because it's just for those who can't see it, which is literally everyone except for me, it's just the top half. It's your arm.
I always wanted to keep it above the elbow.
Yeah,
but,
so that you can manage stigma.
Right, exactly. So I don't show these at work, but now I've got ones on my wrists, and so they are becoming more visible. So I think that kind of broke the seal.
Yeah,
start moving down my arms.
Go crazy, man.
A little bit. Yeah. So these are all done. I'll give him a shout out because I was just talking with him last night.
Yeah.
Nick Scrady at Uptown Tattoo has done all of these over the past, I think, 6 or 7 years.
Okay.
So lots of needle time.
What would you say is the investment, the financial investment in your tattooing?
Oh man.
Yeah, or thousands of dollars
That's what I
at
was
this
gonna
point.
guess.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which I can justify because they're going to be with me for life. So I don't mind throwing.
You don't have to justify
a lot-
it.
yeah,
Like,
I spend
you
a
do
lot more
you.
money on things that I
Well,
don't own
I got an
anymore, so.
idea for you how you could earn that back and they could pay for themselves. If you would convert to Christianity at this point, like write a book and you go around speaking with your tattoos in full view that you were once a satanic priest or something, and you converted to Jesus.
Right.
I mean, you could go around the country giving that testimony and taking up love offerings, and however long it takes for you to get that couple $1,000s back, then you could go back to your atheist.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Showing off my marks of shame from my past, like the pentagram and the Baphomet and everything.
They would love that.
Yeah.
So we should wrap up. I just want to give you an opportunity to plug whatever you want to plug, whether it's your university work or your research work or your social media.
I would just say social media at Dr. Sprankle.
Follow him. He's hilarious.
Yeah, I'm only on Twitter. I tried Instagram for a while. There's not too many photos that are relevant for an academic.
No.
So I couldn't really engage with that well. I'm better with words. So
Well, I found you on Instagram because
did
I
you?
follow Wildflower something or the other. It's this really pro-sex Instagram account. And then so they print screen something that you'd posted. And I was like, this guy.
this
guy's fucking
from
hilarious.
Twitter. They put I
Yeah,
hear
and
that
then
from
they
other
put
people that show up on other platforms that I'm not on, like Snapchat. And
Yeah,
stuff.
they do all the print screen stuff.
Yeah. So just Twitter at Dr. Sprankle.
Twitter, okay.
That's where I'm engaged the most with. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm good.
Anything else? I was going to call you Satan because I was literally just looking at my screen right now
I've
and
been
I
called
saw
that
the word
before.
Satanism.
Satan's helper.
Thanks for coming on, Eric. It's been fascinating, and your expertise on this subject is valuable to a lot of us.
I appreciate that. I've had fun. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you.